And we're back with another episode on fitness. And this time we are looking into specifically recovery and recovery aids and products. And the book is called Good to Go by Christie Ashwanden. I hope I pronounced that right. I don't know if you saw it. Just quickly type that in just to remember her name.
I wonder where she's from, actually.
In fact, do you know what? It's going to be... I'm going to Google.
I think she's American, but the last name sounds quite interesting.
I think I did... She's quite young, actually. 52. Okay. So about the author, I believe she is or was an athlete, if I remember correctly. A lot of her stories are based on. Yeah, and she's now a scientist, and she specializes in sports science. And this book was sort of a great another myth-busting book, I guess you could say. Yeah, where she sort of goes to town on all the different recovery aids, tools, supplements, whatever you name it. And she sort of looks at the studies, explains why the studies aren't particularly conclusive, and basically kind of opens your eyes a little bit to the sort of the stuff that goes on behind the scenes in this industry. Yeah. And this isn't to say that, yeah, exactly. And this isn't to say that the tips, tricks, and tools we use don't actually work. It's just that we don't know for sure that they work. And not trying to jump the gun towards the end of the book, but she does talk a lot about the placebo effect and how that actually might be, the main thing that causes us to recover quicker, or makes us feel like we're recovering quicker, rather than the actual product or the activity we're doing. So yeah, in the introduction, I quite enjoyed it because it actually made me realize, it has become a buzzword now, recovery. To the point now where recovery has changed meaning from the past, where it used to be, you put your feet up and you relax, to now recovery has become something that's more of like something you do, something you have to do. Right? Yeah, and it's. I just thought that was quite an interesting contrast because it's so true, and we almost now feel so guilty because obviously all these people are doing all these different things for their recovery. That, if we're not maximizing our recovery too, we're kind of like skimping on the potential progress we could be making in sport or fitness or nutrition or whatever, because it's almost become as important as doing the fitness or whatever activity itself. It's crazy.
No, it's really interesting. And I think, there is something to be said for like, maybe this is more important for people who are like elite athletes or professionals, because they're trying to close that margin, right? And anything that kind of states, oh, well, you could be better if you do this, right? And in the terms of recovery, there are multiple things that are like, oh, this could help blood flow, this could help, hydration and your body taking up nutrients and all these things. And if you're just a standard person, an average Joe going to the gym, then you may not give it as much weight as like a professional does. But
of course,
it kind of creates this paradigm, and it creates a kind of trickle down effect. Like, oh, if all these like major athletes are doing it, well, then maybe I should do it. Maybe there's something in it that I should be doing. But like you said, a lot of it seems to, well, from reading this book, a lot of it seems to rest on this kind of placebo effect, which we'll get into. But it's just interesting to actually, we take a lot of this stuff for granted. We take for granted that, we'll go to athletics day or we'll play a sport and then afterwards we'll have a Gatorade or a Lucozade and we'll just assume that it's doing something.
So pervasive, you know what I mean? Like I even before this book, right, I believed everything about electrolytes, right? Like I've always thought like, oh, I've just had a hard workout, I've sweated, I need to rebalance my electrolytes. I need to get electrolytes into my system. And it's just nuts how the marketing has become, or has been so consistent, I guess you could say, or so well marketed that most people come to believe that to be 100% the case and haven't even considered that it might not be true, as with a lot of things that we'll find out in this book. But
exactly. We literally are within a paradigm. And there are a lot of paradigms that are put forward based around certain products, which I found fascinating, and just how like, I don't naturally always jump to the conclusion about like, is this scientifically backed? Whether that's to do with like sport and fitness or just any other thing in life. Like now and then I will, but it almost seems like we've just accepted this. And
yeah. But you've made a really good point there about this. You know, not many people check to see if scientifically backed because they rely on their sensations and their kind of, you know, to decide if something works or not, right?
Yes. Yeah.
For example, if you used, I mean, we'll talk about it later in the book, but if you use ice to treat, say, to look at fruit, it tends not to hurt the next day. And the reasoning behind it we'll get into, but that reason itself might not actually help you recover quicker, but it does help dim the pain. And therefore, because you feel like it's done something, you know, you don't need science to back it up because you feel better, right?
Exactly.
When the placebo comes into it, it's like, you know, if we had to rely on science to decide everything we can do in our life, like, you know, it'd take ages, wouldn't you? You have to do loads of different studies. You'd have to find ways to actually make it scientifically valid. You'd have to do it to like a bunch of people. So, you know, relying on your senses, and to be fair, we'll get onto that later in the book where she basically says, you know, rely on your senses more than just like objective numbers, let's just say. I mean, that is in my head why, you know, we all just can't think scientifically all the time. We have to just rely on, you know, our sense to calibrate us to do the right thing, or to, you know.
That is really interesting, and I just wanted to add quickly what I kind of related it to was, I remember when we were reading, I think it was like the Now Habit or something like that, but essentially, you know, the idea of like products such as toothpaste or shampoo that have certain aspects added to it to give a kind of visceral reaction, or like, you know, an actual sensation that kind of closes the loop, right? And it's like,
so it's doing something.
Exactly. It's done something because this has happened. Exactly. And it almost is the same from what like I gathered in the book, that a lot of these products, it almost seems like because there is some physical sensation there, we're like, okay, that must have done something because I felt it, right?
Like when you stretch, you know, it hurts. It must be doing something. Like, well, technically it's doing something because it hurts. It's not doing nothing.
But whether it's doing what they're claiming it's doing is a different matter.
Exactly that. That, or just off the back of that, reminds me of a few things. So like Rory Sufferland used to talk about that a lot with products, but then it was the Bad Science book by Ben Goldcat, if you remember it, but he was talking a lot about how detox products, they have something where like, if you put, I can't remember exactly the context, but it's something to do with like, you put your, not your skin, maybe your spit or something into it, and it would go black. But it goes black no matter what. And it's basically to show that you've been releasing toxins, or you have toxins. And it's once again the use of like, you know, change or something sensory to make it feel like something's happened, or there's a presence of toxins. But the reality was, it was more like whatever you put into it, it would go black anyway. But it's a way of like, you know, convincing people that, oh my God, I'm full of toxins because I've just put my spit into a tube and it's gone black. You know, and it's just really interesting.
It is.
And I just want to quickly touch as well on the idea that obviously this is mainly for more like professional athletes and people who take the sport really seriously, is in using recovery products and recovery tools. But I was going to argue that, to be honest, it's become so mass marketed now that even amateurs are using these supplements and stuff, because what I believe is happening, at least, is when people tend to go into fitness or start training, they are looking at like a goal or an ideal they want to become, right? Whether it's a specific target for running or specific body shape. I think for most people, at least, it is probably the body that they're looking at the most. And what I find is quite nefarious with some of these supplements is they especially for stuff like protein, they have like pictures of like the ideal that you want to be, and they almost kind of like suggest that if you don't take it, you won't get to that ideal as well. And that's why I think it's becoming more mass marketed, these products.
Yes. And I think off the back of that is that it almost it kind of also promises like a quick route to get to that. And I think we're all like very impatient, as you know, we're inherently impatient, and we want something quickly. We want to reach that goal that you were talking about. We want to get there quicker, right? Because it's just easy. It's, you know, tick the box.
But that's the promise of it, these things, like, these things help you recover, and recovery is the main part of getting to this state. So if you can speed up your recovery, you can get to the state quicker. So it's almost like the logic inherent is there. Like you have to take it to hit your goals quicker, right?
Yeah.
So yeah,
interesting.
Let's sort of jump into the notes then. So I just wanted to touch on this first bit. So this recovery arms race. So the market for products and services that claim to aid in post-exercise recovery is booming, according to the numbers. This search for a competitive edge in recovery has created a race with athletes seeking faster bounce back methods and entrepreneurs rushing to offer solutions, not just to professionals, but also to recreational athletes and fitness enthusiasts, as we just touched on. So today, there seems to be a product or service marketed for every aspect of post-exercise recovery. Feeling tired? Try a recovery drink to restore energy. Sore muscles? Choose from massages, compressors, supplements, or cold treatments. Feeling run down? Check out a massage or meditation app. Struggling with sleep? There are trackers and apps for that too. And I just thought that's quite interesting that like every single angle has some form of product or process attached to it, rather than the good old common sense would be just put your legs up and relax, So what exactly is recovery? The proliferation of recovery products and services can seem excessive since we all know what recovery is and how to achieve it in its most basic form, a return to readiness following intense exercise or competition. Nevertheless, we have managed to make every aspect of it, such as nutrition, relaxation, and sleep, much more complicated and expensive and time-consuming than before. And I think this almost reminds me a little bit of this, the paradox of choice. So, there's almost so much choice now that we get even anxious about, not optimizing. I don't know about you, I feel that as well. Especially if you're putting in the effort in the gym, you feel anxious about not optimizing because you're just like, well, I put all that effort in. If I'm not making the 100% best effort I can to optimize my recovery, then I'm slacking in some sort of sense, or I'm missing out on that option to get there quicker. And I feel like that's what they prey on a lot as well, especially with all this choice, because then you become so confused and you just do a bit of everything and you never really stick to it as well. You just become like this mess of different recovery techniques and tools and
absolutely. And I think we have this kind of approach where, like you said, we have to kind of optimize everything. And I think that's something that is constantly bombarding society, because naturally we're a capitalistic society, so everyone should work, and if everyone's working to the optimal, then it's ideal. But also, if you're already engaging in physical exercise, then you're probably more along that spectrum than others, right? And so if you've already started engaging in that, then why not? Why shouldn't I optimize, right? And that's when it's kind of almost you're more susceptible to all of these kind of products that are being pushed, because it's like, oh, okay, well, if I'm doing this, I might as well do it 100%. And this is saying this is how I get to 100%, right?
Yeah. And I think there's also another thing which coincides with that, which we'll talk about later as well, is this rise of trackers and stuff where they give it a number, because then the optimization becomes a bit more concrete. So beforehand, I guess you could say you would optimize your senses, how you feel, let's just say. But now you can have stuff which tracks your sleep, right? So now you're going to optimize how many minutes you're sleeping without.
Well, it says it tracks your sleep, right?
Yeah, whilst forgetting that these things might be inaccurate. And I love the this idea, because me and you both have those Oura rings, and we track our sleep from time to time. But it's so funny because we've said this so many times before, where I can look at my Oura ring and see that I slept a really good amount, like 7 hours and a half, let's just say, or something like that, and I still feel like shit. And it's like, which one is a better indicator of my sleep quality? How I feel, which is probably the most logical thing, because it's taking into account multiple different factors which the ring can't capture, or the ring which says, I've had a 7.5 hours sleep, I must have fully recovered. It's just we've become obsessed with this, anything you put a number to, it means it's it's true. It can be increased, it can be improved, but we forget that sometimes our senses, for example, take into account multiple different metrics of biology that we can't measure, even with these stuff that measures. It's crazy. You come to this you come almost full circle now. I think there's this counterculture, I guess, against this tracking now. It's just let's go back to common sense like it used to be. Let's just if we feel like shit, let's not go to the gym. Let's lie in bed and recover. It's crazy, but
no, absolutely.
So
it actually what I find quite interesting is that, and I see this not just within fitness industry, but food industry and everything like that. What we seem to do is the healthiest thing essentially is to just be in line with nature, how we kind of evolved. But what we end up trying to do is we diverge, saying, oh, we should be over here. Then what happens is that kind of creates issues, because there's a discrepancy between that and where we should be in line with. And so then a solution is provided, right? As if as if that's going to make something different. And it's only over time that we end up coming back to this kind of inline bit. And it's it's like we've taken a massive fucking detour to just stay back where we were. And it's like, you look at all these things, right? It's like, think about prior to meditation and all that lot that has now come into like the mainstream.
Yeah.
Right. But prior to that, it was like, oh, you need to do this, you need to do that. And all these like really complex tools of dealing with stress and depression and all these kind of things. And now it's kind of come back to being like,
fresh air, you know?
Just go for exactly, right? Meditate for a little bit. But what's funny is that
in nature and not think about things, you know?
It's things that are so simple. But what's funny is that when we do that detour and we come back, the only difference is that now it's commercialized, now it's commodified. And it's just kind of interesting that, like, you know, loads of people have made money along the way. Loads of people have either, like, you know, been damaged or impaired or have suffered along the way. Like, we'll get onto this in terms of like metabolic or in terms of food and how, you know, that's like coming back. But then when you come back to this point, which is in line with kind of just how we've evolved and doing like basic stuff and listening to your body, that it's now like commodified. And I just find that kind of interesting.
There's this sort of massive move toward like obfuscation, you know, where like you make things more technical and complex when the reality can be simpler, but we just decide to make it more complex to like It's like, you know when the old days, I liken it to like having like priests used to preach to you the word of the God, and they only had access to the terminology and the books, and they're the only ones who could give you this, like, you know, the knowledge and hiding behind big words and hiding behind, you know, I guess the old science, let's just call it. And it kind of reminds me of that a little bit, because they get value out of being able to make things more complex, right? Like where the reality is, the more simple something can be, the more you can follow it, the more you can like adapt it to your life, right? Like, for example, you know, like what we're just saying here. So like, you know, you can choose between massaging, you choose between supplements, you choose between protein shakes, all this choice. But the reality is, if you just eat enough food, you know, the right sort of macronutrients, and you rest, like I said, you don't do more exercise and you get enough rest, you're probably going to be okay. And you sleep a lot, right? It's just funny. So without further ado, let's get into some of this book. So the first chapter was called Just Say Science. And this is where you sort of get introduced to Christie. And I think she was running, if I remember, she was saying she was part of a running club, I think, if I was correct in this. And she happened to be having a beer after doing a big run. I can't remember if it was a 10K, 5K, or whatever. It wasn't particularly important. It was just, she kind of had this insight, which is like, is a beer an actual good recovery drink? Because obviously logic kind of says it might not be, as one of the sort of longer term effects of drinking alcohol, for example, dehydrates you, right? And obviously, you know, as we said before, with electrolytes and stuff, there's this common belief now that we need to be hydrated. But this chapter went deep into her, and she created a study around beer, because she basically wanted to answer this question: is beer, or can beer be a good recovery drink? And this is the chapter, I think, well, the first chapter that sort of hooked me on this book, because it kind of made me realize the standard of the scientific studies that go into like fitness studies. And she basically talks as well. So I'm going to summarize the chapter. We can get into the notes afterwards. But she does the experiment, and then she kind of walks away with a feeling being like, hang on a second, you know, even though the results kind of tell me what I wanted to hear, or they gave me some sort of result that was statistically significant or whatever, she realized that from doing the experiment herself, because she was a participant in it, that there was many ways that it was kind of wrong, or not wrong, but it was failing to test what she wanted. And then she started to criticize her own study. And I thought that was really, really interesting, because it kind of made me realize that this is, you know, if this is the standard for what is being done in the fitness industry, and she can even call bullshit to herself, you know, and then people are using that as like sort of gospel to, you know, to inform others on the best ways to recover, then there's something that's wrong here, or something that's not 100% correct. But yeah, I don't know what.
Absolutely. I thought it was quite interesting. Just, you know, the result did say what she wanted, right? And so there was a level of ego, a level of reputation that, you know, she could indulge in if she was to like publish the results, and they were publishable, right? But I think I think it was really interesting that, you know, she was like, well, wait a minute, like, does this make sense? And if it doesn't, why not? Is it to do with my study? And I wonder if there is something to be said for researchers participating in their own study to try and find flaws in it, right? As in, like, it might be worth like being an actual participant to be able to point out like, oh, this is where I could have cheated. This is where I could have cheated. Yeah, okay. It may be biased because they know the hypothesis, but still, I think it would be quite interesting to kind of hold you accountable, because almost it's like then your integrity is on the line, right? Because you know that there are multiple holes in your like study that may explain why the result is what it is. And so if you go ahead and you publish it, then you might have there might be more friction to doing so, because you'll be like, actually, I know that this isn't 100% correct study, or at least I should write this up, right? For
sure.
Interesting.
It was interesting, and there was a lot of. In fact, let's just get into it, and then we can interpret it as we go. So, designing the beer study. So, if beer, or more specifically the alcohol in beer, impairs recovery, we'd expect that runners who drank it after their depleting afternoon run would run out of gas faster in the next morning's run to exhaustion compared to those who didn't booze. Beer also might also make the exhaustion run feel more difficult. So we'd ask runners to rate how hard the effort felt throughout the run. Finally, the alcohol might alter the proportion of fats and carbohydrates burned for fuel. And so we'd also take a metabolic measurement that could capture this too. So if I remember correctly, the test was they did a run one afternoon, like a decent run. So it's like, maybe I can't remember exactly what it was, but maybe like 5K. Let's just say it was something like that. They had a beer, I think 1 or 2 beers, I believe. Might have been 3. And then the next morning, they then had to go and do a run again. I think was something similar, sort of like a decent distance. And it was, I believe, a run to exhaustion test, which means they run until they can't run anymore. Which is funny, because she even goes into the sort of why a run to exhaustion test, which is the sort of gold standard for these exercises, isn't a correct way to test, because exhaustion is kind of it is subjective to some degree, right? Like, I mean, I'm sure everybody who's listening can agree to some extent that if they're doing a running or some form of exercise and it gets quite tough mentally to continue, they often just give up. Okay. But then there's some instances where, like, if you're involved in a competition, let's just say, or you're trying to beat a personal score, you're more inclined to go past that, negative feeling and continue. So therefore, the run to exhaustion test is not actually a very good test, because it allows people to just, decide not to continue running, even though they probably could continue running. And there's multiple. And I think there was one other thing she did mention as well about this, about the nudging. So there was like a brief before the exercise as well. The guy says normally when people do this, they do it for 18 minutes. And because he suggested 18 minutes, and to be fair, I've noticed this even in myself. When I say to myself when I'm going to the gym, I'm going to run for 12 minutes today, I literally run for 12 minutes. And the moment that clock goes, I'm like, I'm done. And I sometimes now try and like lie to myself. I'm like, I'm running for 20 minutes to try and at least like anchor me on that. But this is another point, like, just by that one small change where the guy says, this is what is expected of you, then the expectation is created. And therefore these people then want to run for that amount of time minimum. Whereas it would be really interesting if they redid the test and put maybe 12 minutes or 16 minutes and just see how many of these people finished around that time frame.
No, exactly. Like it is really interesting in how, these studies, especially around like exhaustion, let's say, are devoid of context and factors that contribute to like a certain result in reality. It's not ecologically valid, to speak. And, I think there was a good point where she was talking about one of the guys who participated, and they were talking about how long they ran for and whether they thought they should run longer. And one of them was like, well, but I had to pick up my kid from nursery daycare. So I need to, kind of cut it short. And it's just interesting. And those things, obviously, like, they're not a big deal, but when you publish results, they are, because it skews the idea saying that, people couldn't run for as long. And so therefore beer, in this case, impacts.
The only way you get rid of a result like that is technically by doing a massive data sample where that result will become an anomaly, for example, right? So it was just really interesting to hear, like, her also just talking about it and dissecting it, being like, hang on, like even I realized when I was doing this that there's multiple areas where, you know, this fails to be, I guess what you could say, scientifically valid, right? I'm just looking here as well at the notes. So there were 3 measures that alcohol might alter during the run to exhaustion. So the ratings of perceived exhaustion, so how hard the run felt, which is what you were saying while they asked them how hard it was. Respiratory exchange rate, so a measure of what kind of fuel the body is burning, and the time required to reach the exhaustion point. And then I thought it was quite interesting. So the results of the study did actually show something, right? So it was that men in the study reached their breaking point at an average of 21% sooner the morning after they downed the alcoholic beer, while the woman, on average, kept running 22% longer during the run to exhaustion following the beer. So this is the point where she kind of was like, I found something here. There must be something behind it, you know, that maybe women have something that could help them digest the alcohol, whatever. She was trying to come up with reasons, but then she kind of sat back and went, actually, hang on a second here. You know, my common sense tells me, you know, beer should definitely not improve performance. So maybe the study is, you know, invalid, and that's where she started coming up with these sort of criticisms, which I don't know. It kind of opened my eyes.
Exactly. And I think you're right in the sense that, you know, once you have the result, you're trying to find a story that it fits to, and it kind of ties in this kind of just so stories. And I remember we were taught this at uni, but the idea that like something is as it is, and then you try and find a reason to explain it, a justification or a rationalization. So one of the like funny Rudyard Kipling's, I think it's like a kid's book, is like the elephant has a really long trunk because alligator bit it and pulled it, and it was its nose. Originally it had a short nose, and then it became a really long thing. Or something to do with like, you know, a giraffe, why it's got a long neck. And the thing that's interesting is that they're unfalsifiable, right? And in the case of science, obviously that's an issue because you want to be able to try and falsify a theory. That's the whole point of science. And so in this case, you know, you could like jump to certain conclusions and be like, well, you know, beer is made up of carbs, and carbs, you know, give energy, and so all this like blah blah. But essentially, you're like, you know, you're scraping,
aren't you? You're trying your best to create a reason or like a rationalization for why this might have happened, rather than actually thinking, could it have been the study, right? You're then giving credence to like explanations over the fact that you're not even, you know, paying the right attention to potentially the fact that the study could not have been testing what you wanted it to test, right?
Absolutely.
Did I make the note here as well? I can't remember if I made the note, but they did talk about an alternative to it.
Interesting.
An alternative test to the running to exhaustion. Oh, that was it. Yeah. So a time trial. They were saying stuff like in a time trial would be better. So where you kind of like give them the motivation to actually want to maybe hit their best in a time trial, right? But even then, you're still messing around with potential expectation effects by setting a time trial and being like, you know, you could easily influence somebody just by giving them that extra bit of motivation. Be like, oh, you did this last time, make sure you beat it this time, you know? I'm sure that would have some form of effect.
And I think what's really interesting is like, you know, they like you were saying at the very beginning of this podcast, talking about, you know, we can only measure certain things, and yet based on, you know, the measurements that we have, right, the things that we can observe, but there are so many other processes going on in the background that we can't measure, and so we kind of neglect. And I think it's important that, you know, to mention that, for instance, when she's designing her experiment, she's saying this and this means that like this is recovery, right? These variables, as in, you know, reaching this point tells us about recovery, but they're just assuming that relationship, right? They're creating that relationship. They're having one variable, another variable, and saying this is a relationship. But what's interesting is like that may not be what contributes to that kind of variable in reality. There may be a bunch of other variables, and it's almost like kind of gestalt, right? Like the sum of the parts is larger than the whole? I can't remember how it goes. You know what I mean? As in like, the sum of the parts is greater. And I wonder if that's I wonder if that plays a big part in kind of scientific research, because there are so many other variables that they can't measure, and yet that contribute to this kind of relationship, and yet we've kind of simplified it down to basic variables, saying this is what it is.
And they've also assumed here that recovery means performance.
Yeah,
right. For example, you could even say recovery could be, for example, you could monitor or measure the contractile strength of the glutes or the muscles that were used. You know, you could try and find a way to measure the power output, right? And then you could be like, well, you can see that this facet of recovery, which is the power output of the legs, is good. But you can see this facet, the overall performance isn't as good. And then you could come up with actual explanations to explain the difference. It's like, okay, well, the power output's there, but actually the exhaustion run wasn't there. Maybe that's because of what you said, where the study was flawed and some guy wanted to pick up his kids, or, you know, or whatever, right? It's, and I just thought it was super interesting. And I made this note as well on this chapter about the alcohol and strength training, just because I was interested and I wanted to remember it. And if I remember, so look at this correctly, it was something that 1 to 2 beers shouldn't actually cause, or 1 to 2 drinks shouldn't actually cause too much interference with muscle training. But I do believe, once again, when this study was done, it's like a one-off thing. So you have 1 to 2 beers after muscle training, then you train, didn't show effects, right? But if you did that every bloody day, 1 to 2 beers, I'm sure the cumulative effect would be more negative, right? It's one of those things as well that you forget that studies, if they don't do it over time, you're not measuring the cumulative effect of these things, right? A one-off beer, fine, of course, maybe it will probably cause like micro differences, right? Which is probably why also her study showed maybe 21% of the men or whatever, but not massive differences. But if you were to do that again and again and again, and you were training and not getting enough recovery and also drinking, I'm sure the results would change, and it would be probably more dramatic and drastic. But it's also very hard to do tests like that, where you literally say to somebody, feed yourself alcohol every night and also run 5 kilometers and, you know, not really recover properly, and do that over the course of a month. You know, there's constraints to studies as well, which is one of the other points I picked up on this, is like, you have to find people willing to do these studies, and then are they representative of the people that you want to measure as well? It's just science is just, it's a best guess. It's like it's trying to make it as as controlled as possible, but unfortunately, just the way the world works, it's always going to be impossible. So basically, whatever these studies show should always be taken with some form of pinch of salt, because it's literally impossible to control all these variables.
There's so much complexity.
Genetics. There's more to it than just like people having a beer and running. Some people metabolize alcohol differently, and you're not even measuring that. It's just like, and it's just under the guise of, you know, throw some numbers in there, throw a bit of statistical analysis. Oh, look at us, we've done some great science here. It's just like, oh, fantastic. It's just a little bit of a rant, because it's just from this book, it really made me realize, it really sunk in. I was like, fuck me, like, we've come to put so much faith in like studies. Like, I think somebody sent me something the other day being like, studies suggest that we'll live to 120. And I was like, fuck off. Studies suggest that, I don't know, I could grow my dick to 20 inches or something like that. You know what I mean? It's some bullshit. Like, it's just, it's nonsense. It's absolute really nonsense.
And it's just, it's like,
studies have become synonymous with science. Like, what would you mean? Like, oh, study suggests, or science suggests. Like, that's kind of like the inference made when you're like, oh, a study says this. It's like, but how good is the study? Where's it from? Who did the study? You know, it's it's criminal.
It's when studies are being implemented to guide decision making, that's when you've got to be skeptical, right? Because what I find so interesting, right, is like is when you see like proper scientists, right? All they do is they say a result. Right? They don't say this is what should happen from it. They're like, we did a study. This is what happened. Right? And this is what happened.
And they suggest, but they never say. But they never say anything, right? They're never conclusive. They're never like, this means this. They're like, this suggests. I think the word suggest is the best way of explaining it.
And Andrew Human is like a great example of that, because he'll be like, there was a study here, and this is kind of like what happened, right? And obviously then he does suggest stuff afterwards, but it's more like, this is just what happened, right?
But once again,
it's not a given that this should
suggestion. It's a suggestion, not like a, know, here's the truth. Like, it's like, this suggests that this is what's happening, you know, or this suggests that this might be a good idea. It's not like, this is a good idea. And if you could ever say this is a good idea, it's usually when you have lots of proof and backups, of like lots of evidence to say it is, you know, like, I don't know.
And that's what's funny. That's the discrepancy between, you know, a scientist and someone who's using scientific material. And we'll touch on this a lot in the book, but essentially, you know, give someone an inch and they'll take a whole foot, or whatever the expression is. Because in this case, one study might show a tiny little like percentage of increase, and then someone takes, a scientist would just be like, this is the result, and then someone takes that and is like, okay, so this means that you can improve, by this fold or whatever, and they just completely distort it. And I think that's what's kind of, that's where we're kind of at the moment. That's why people jump onto all these like commodifying certain like research.
And then I'd also say there's like a market as well for like, similar to this study I was talking about, with like studies show you can live to 120, where they basically, in my head, they've probably just picked like a rate of increase over the years and gone like, okay, if this keeps increasing for 20 years, without realizing that, nothing ever just goes linearly up.
A linear progression.
And what I think is quite interesting as well is I wonder whether some people or some news agencies actually create these studies with just really crap science just to create headlines, because it gets some clicks. Oh, what? Somebody says the study shows that we can live to 120. Somebody clicks on it. Oh, really cool. Like share it with your friends. It's like it suits their agenda for promoting, clickbait, so to speak, right? Studies show miracle cure for cancer is coming in 2 years, or miracle cure. Like the amount of times I've seen cures for cancer appear, and still there isn't one, right? Like it's just like miracle. Like studies show this could be the cure we've all waiting for. It's like just wishful thinking, isn't it? It's like and they don't. And there's no incentive. Once again, we were talking before about like with dissertations and stuff, but there's no incentives for these media companies to actually double check these studies. They can just be like studies show, because studies equal science to them. Studies equal rationale behind things. Even if the rationale is completely flawed based upon crap studies.
And there's no accountability because they have.
Oh, no, there's no accountability because there's a study. There's a study that says
exactly.
It.
It's plausible deniability. Like I say,
there's a study that backs up what I'm saying.
Exactly.
Let's finish this chapter off. So the important takeaways from this experience. The important lesson Christie took away was that it's crucial to ask whether a study is really measuring what it's supposed to, and whether that measurement translates to something you care about in real life. So that's, I think, the crucial part here is like, real life, not studies, not where people know they're being studied. It's also why there's some quite interesting books I remember on, I think it's called Why Everybody Lies, and there's another one which I forget the name, but anyway, it talks more about, instead of asking people what they want, we go and look at their Google search histories and find out what people are actually searching. By looking at what people actually do rather than what they say they do in a research context, you can learn more about humanity than you can from science. So like somebody got access to like Google's search history, I can't remember what it was, and he did like an analysis on it. I think it's something to do with like sexual orientations and all this sort of stuff. But like that's a lot more realistic at how people actually behave in the real world than, a scientific study of, 50 people in a cohort that they know they're doing a scientific study on psychology or whatever. They might be in a double blind, I don't know, but they still know something's going on, so it's not natural.
Absolutely. They don't know they're being observed, essentially.
Yes. I don't know if I'm going to read this bit here. No. I think that's quite an interesting point here as well. That she discovered that it's not enough to ask, does this thing work? First, you have to start with a more fundamental question. How would we know if it's working? What are the benefits to this gizmo or ritual we're supposed to deliver, and how would we measure that? So this is specifically for the products we're about to go into. Sort of, do they work? Are they actually helping recovery, etc.? And then we go into chapter 2, which was Be Like Mike. I don't know if you want to start taking it away.
So so this is to do with the Gatorade example, isn't it? So sprinkle an appealing idea with a dash of science, and it can seem more powerful or true than the evidence really shows. What's worse, good luck overturning an idea once it's become part of a sporting law. That was a lesson I would learn soon. So yes, the story of Gatorade. So the age of the athlete-endorsed sports drinks began on a Florida football field in the mid-1960s. Back then, most coaches and athletes didn't give much thought to fluid replacement during practice or competition. But in 1965, a University of Florida football coach came to Dr. Robert Cade and his team of university doctors, complaining that his players were wilting in the heat. He also wondered why his players never urinated during games. What a strange thing to wonder.
It's such a strange thing to wonder if you think about it. It's like, can you imagine saying that to somebody? Like, you seem like you haven't peed today.
After some investigation, Cade and his colleagues concluded that two factors were causing the players to fall victim to the heat. They weren't replenishing the fluids and salts they were sweating out, nor were they restoring the carbohydrates their bodies were burning for fuel. Cade figured he could solve the problem by helping players replace these lost resources. So he stirred together some sodium, sugar, and monopotassium phosphate with water to create a drink soon dubbed Gatorade, after the University of Florida nickname the Gators. I kind of love when you just find out a bit of history about some random product you never knew about.
Like the name behind it, so like the Gatorade. The way it's like, because obviously it's such a staple now, I guess you could say. I mean, I would say less so Gatorade. I think Gatorade is definitely more of an American brand.
Thing.
I still do know of Gatorade. I mean, I guess that's what you could say, how pervasive it's been. I honestly can't remember if it's still even available to buy in the UK. I can't remember the last time I ever saw it, but I've heard of it, right?
And like there's Powerade and Lucozade, like there's
which is funny because Powerade was Coca-Cola's attempt, I believe, at entering the market.
Was it? Yeah.
It was.
I think she did mention that, didn't she? Yeah.
So yes, and then he went on to explain, marketing a need. What followed was a national campaign to sell the public on the idea that exercise caused dehydration. The cure was Gatorade's specially developed drink, and this tonic was critical for sports performance. It was created by a doctor, after all, and tested in studies. In a stroke of genius, Gatorade turned the drink's sodium, phosphorus, and potassium into a special selling point by rebranding these ordinary salts, and I love this, their scientific name, electrolytes, which is simply the scientific term for molecules that produce ions when dissolved in water. And this is just classic marketing 101, isn't it? It's like, take something that's boring like salts, give it a sexy scientific name. Fuck it, I'm going to start reading some more science books and nomenclature of science. Finding stuff that's normal and call it something else which sounds really sciencey, and then package it up in a bundle and say, God, buy this. It's crazy, isn't it? So Gatorade may not have been the first to use this term, but they're the ones that landed electrolytes in the public lexicon, because electrolytes weren't yet a household word in the early days of sports drinks. People could mistake them for special compounds that need to be taken in sports drinks' magical formula if you were to replenish the fluids lost during exercise. Gatorade wasn't alone in promoting the benefits of drinking before, during, and after exercise. Other sports drink manufacturers, such as the drug companies Novartis, makers of Isotar, never heard of it, and GlaxoSmithKline, Lucozade Sport. That's an interesting part. I didn't know GlaxoSmithKline did Lucozade Sport, but
I didn't know.
Also pointed to the science of marketing their products. Lucozade, for example, established a sports science academy to promote its drink. I think this is pretty nefarious when you think about it. Because these guys have obviously got lots of scientists on their books to create the studies, to do the studies, to prove the things. So it was no longer sufficient to simply drink some water and eat a meal after exercising. The idea these marketing campaigns fostered was that physical activity created extraordinary nutritional needs, and these specially formulated beverages were the best way to meet them. This was science speaking. Oh, I just love it. It really opens my eyes a little bit, because when you start thinking about it, it's just, that is how the word became well known. That's how we all now come to know electrolytes. And it's like there was commercial interests that, supplanted this in people's consciousness, which always makes me start thinking a little bit like, is it really correct to do, or is it 100% necessary, right?
And that's exactly. And it's like you're taking an example here that like people were wilting in the sun. I mean, they're playing fucking football in the burning sun.
I'd be wilting in the sun too,
Everyone would be fucking wilting, right? And they just probably too busy playing sport than taking a break and having some water, so it makes sense why that would be the case, but it doesn't necessarily mean that your body can't get enough without because you made some drink with fucking sugar I think that's a beats very water, or like
important part you just mentioned, that it makes sense, and that is probably why it's so pervasive. It just makes logical sense, doesn't it? You've just sweated, you can visually see the sweat, so it's super important to replace what was lost with the sweat, right? You almost seem crazy to suggest that's not true, right? Because that is exactly true. If you lose stuff through sweat,
you see it, right? And then exactly, we're all aware like what sweat is, and so if you're losing that, then it's like, oh well, how can I get it back? And water seems like a boring like because it's so simple, right? It's back to that simplicity. It's like just drinking water. It's so simple. It's like, surely there's something better. And it's like, and then someone says, oh, this is better. You can get more from this, when, in reality.
So on this topic, before we go into the sort of Michael Jordan promoting it, so do we even need sports drinks to replenish our electrolytes? Your body maintains some reserves of the vital ions that it can tap into as needed to keep your body's fluid and salt balance in check. So we do lose electrolytes through sweat. But even when you exercise continuously for many hours, you will simply correct for any losses via your normal appetite and hunger mechanisms, which I thought was really interesting. Because I think, if I remember correctly, it makes you more inclined to want salty foods, right? If I remember correctly, or like it incentivizes you to eat more salt. So you can replenish your electrolytes with food instead. In a study involving 10 men who were trained cyclists or triathletes, researchers found that it didn't really matter whether they drank plain water, a sports drink, or milk-based beverages after an hour of hard exercise. As long as they drank some liquids along with a meal, they restored their fluid levels just fine. I mean, how did we survive all these years without electrolytes drinks? You know, it's crazy.
It's actually crazy.
All those, hunter-gathering societies, they all just died of thirst after
I see. Thing is that I'm surprised there haven't been like ad campaigns where it starts right with like, it's looking at the ground, then suddenly like a foot lands on it, how it does, and then this guy's like running and he's with like a spear and he like gets a fucking gazelle or something and then whips out a Gatorade and is just like, drinking it there, right? Like, I'm surprised that shit hasn't happened, just because it's just
or you have the cross comparison of one person doing it and like you see him wilting in the sun dying, but his friend with Gatorade drinking it, killing this gazelle. You should have had some of this stuff, bucko.
I mean they do it with like, what is it? Is it Snickers? It's like grown nuts, or you're not you nuts, without
you're not you when you're hungry. When you're not hungry, you're not you when you're hungry. And they're always like a diva. Yeah, I love it.
Yeah.
That's good advertising.
Funny. That's funny. Maybe we should go into marketing,
That's it. So athlete endorsements. So Gatorade also paid for athlete endorsements, such as a famous campaign with Michael Jordan. With this, the meaning of Gatorade changed. To drink Gatorade wasn't just to mimic a sports hero. It was to imagine a causal relationship. Jordan drank Gatorade and then made all those slam dunks. The one thing that must have something to do with the other. Therefore, psychologists call this thinking as illusional causality. And so it is so powerful that it spawned an entire genre of advertising, the celebrity endorsement. But I love that. I like this little saying. Did you pick up on this as well? So the Irish have a saying: an umbrella accompanies the rain, but rarely causes it. The same could be said of product endorsements and athletic greatness, but still our minds are quick to connect the dots. It's just
and it's. But I think it's really interesting.
Yeah,
so good.
No, I was just gonna say. I think the reason why, for example, with stuff like this, it has a more causative like perception, is because of the fact that it kind of makes logical sense that it would help your performance. And because it's marketed as a performance enhancer, it therefore has a causal relationship. Whereas, for example, right, I think if Michael Jordan, obviously, if he wears specific clothing, still people will buy it. But I think they buy it for different reasons. They buy it more because they're aware of the clothing and they want the clothing because it's associated with him. But they don't associate a causal relationship with the clothing. They don't think he's wearing his Jordans, that's why he plays so well. But maybe they do if they've been specially rationally designed by science. But obviously with electrolytes, because it's backed up with rationality and reasoning behind it, therefore it's easier to imagine like a causal relationship, or at least that's what I think, at least.
No, I agree. I think there's also like I think there's a few components. One is we love to watch people who push the boundaries of performance, right? And especially if you're also in that sport, then you have this kind of aspiration to be like that person. I mean, Michael Jordan is a hero to God knows how many people, especially people who are obsessed with basketball. And so I think you want it to, right? You want there to be this kind of product that helps you get it to be like that, right? That it like ticks this box. It says you can be like this. We want to, and there's even like a point later on in the book. It's like, athletes want to believe that this magic works, right? They want to, they want a solution. And I think that's
they want to believe that this drink that could give them a 2% edge will give them a 2% edge, because they want the edge. Exactly. So therefore they want They want anything that can help them get there.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, it's a really interesting point.
So then the next part was, do sports drinks work? So when a team of medical researchers trained in the evaluation of scientific findings had a look at the research underpinning the boom in the sports drinks, they reached a startling conclusion. Quotes, as it turns out, if you apply evidence-based methods, the 40 years of sports drinks research does not seemingly add up to much. So this was from Carl Heneghan and his colleagues at the University of Oxford Centre for Evidence-Based Medicine. They wrote in 2012, they wrote this in a 2012 analysis published in the British Medical Journal. When Heneghan's team gathered and examined all of the available evidence on sports drinks, they even consulted sports drinks manufacturers to ask them for supporting studies, though not all complied. They found what amounted to a bunch of preliminary or inconclusive evidence packaged as more definitive proof. And that is where it gets a bit more, even more nefarious, right? It's, I think I spoke to you the other day about, I want to say it was this David Deutsch book, but it's like this, we've come into an age of justificationism where now we almost use scientific studies to justify things which might not necessarily be true, but you do it in a way that doesn't get you in legal trouble, right? It's like studies show that you can live to 120. It might not be true, but you can't get done for lying because it's a study, you know?
Yeah.
But it just so happens the study was done shitly. But this is where it gets even better, because if you have scientists doing it and they can make it so it's like, it's a pretty good study, right? It's not like 100%, but it's a good enough study. But they tweak a few variables, so they make it that there's always going to be some form of percentage increase based upon using a sports drink. So I don't know if I got the note here. In fact, no, I think we do here. Yeah, there we go. In fact, we do have it. So let's go into it. The problems with some of these studies. So too small. The first and almost universal problem among these studies done was that they were too small to produce meaningful results. Then this is the part that I liked. Designed to show results. Another shortcoming was the studies were often designed in a way that almost assured that they'd find a benefit from the sports drink. So instead of comparing a product to what athletes would otherwise consume, they compare some new nutritional product against exercising on empty, so fasting. Cohen argues that that's not a fair test of the product's benefits in real world conditions. And that's really interesting, isn't it? Like they're using it as like, oh, that's the control. Because like that's not a normal real world control.
It's not the baseline. Yeah, exactly.
The baseline isn't fasted. The baseline is probably fed on something, right? And therefore they might have even done it originally with that, but they've like removed that result from the experiment, because if it did show evidence that proved that what they were trying to sell doesn't actually do anything meaningfully different, the best way to do it is compare it against something that does make or does show a difference, right?
Exactly. If you get to choose your reference point of comparison, then you can always choose one that basically shows that your hypothesis is correct. And I think this is like this is kind of how, I'm not going to say science in general, but like, you know, how we've kind of shifted. What it should be is there's an observation, right, of behavior of like, okay, maybe this is the case. So you have a hypothesis, then science occurs, and then it's commodified. But now it's almost like that has switched, where there's an observation, there's a hypothesis, that it's commodified, and then science is used to back it up, right? So there's already an incentive.
Commodified and commercialized as well, right?
Exactly. You
know, people have vested interest.
If you're doing science post any kind of investment towards creating a product, well, it's you're invested in it, right? You want it to back up because you've already committed time, money, energy, all these other things to creating a product. And so you need it to justify that. And so you will manipulate it in a way to back up what you're saying.
I think it's funny as well. There's a bit later on we'll get onto in the supplement industry. But I believe, thinking about it, the sports drinks are part of the supplement industry. It's not like a medical based study. So what they discuss later on in the book is the fact that when these people do these studies, if you're doing it to do with medicine and drugs, you have to show your results and your studies, regardless of if you showed nothing, right? So there's complete transparency on everything you do. Whereas with these guys, they can, if there's a study they do and it doesn't show a result, they wipe the floor. It never existed. It didn't happen. And therefore, the only thing they ever showcase is studies to prove it, right? And this is another classic thing where, how can you legally take somebody to court when they have 20 pieces of scientific studies or 20 scientific studies showing a result which they've manufactured? You can't. Because you're arguing against science then. you know.
And
But it's not scientific
yeah.
necessarily, right? And this is the point. It's just
It shouldn't be considered science because that's not what the scientific method is, essentially, is it? It's like you're picking and choosing the results that back up, even though there may be 60 other studies that say that it's fucking bullshit, but you've hidden that under the under the rug. And I think once again, it's like, in that supplement bit that we'll talk about later, but it depends what you classify your product as, right? If you're, like you said, if it's a drug, then it needs to show what it's supposed to, although even then it's, still got vested interests, but it's held to more kind of strict rules and regulations. Whereas if it's a food or it's just a supplement, it doesn't have to. And so it's not bound by the same criteria. And that's what's flawed, because then essentially, if it claims anything, it can claim what it wants, right? And then because it's not held to any like strict criteria, the benefit is just to produce results that support it, right? It doesn't matter whether they make it or not, right? They could claim something without any scientific studies behind it, but it is better if they're like, oh, but we did do one and it said it was right, it supported it, right? And this is a huge issue. They're not held accountable for what their claims are.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, like you said, they didn't even some of the companies didn't even comply with showing them evidence to do it. And so continuing on with the shortcomings of the experiments. So another one was the placebo effect. Some of the dazzling powers that sports drinks display in the studies touted by their makers may be nothing more than the placebo effect. When people volunteer for a study to test a new sports drink, they come to it with an expectation that the product will have some performance benefit. Which is just, it's been proven time and time again that the placebo effect is, a massive effect, even in medicine. So why wouldn't it have the same effects with sports drinks, And then the last one was not applicable to real world performance. So the BMJ analysis also concluded that many of the measures made in these studies may have looked good on paper, but aren't things that matter when it comes to real world performance. Very few athletes ever compete in events where the purpose is to keep going until you can't. Instead, most of us care more about the answers to questions like, does it help me perform better or feel less fatigue? Worryingly, most performance tests used to assess sports drinks have never been validated. And this once again is back to this running to exhaustion test. It's the classic. It's always been done that way. So, we're going to keep doing it this way. Rather than thinking, does it actually measure the thing we wanted to measure or wanted to show, right? And it's the classic because they can just blame it on that. Oh, well, we just did what everybody else does. It's like
exactly
plausible deniability once again. Oh, we're just doing what everybody else does. So, sorry.
Oh God, it's just
So the conclusion. Heineken and his team concluded that claims about sports drinks rely on small studies with comparisons groups that rig studies in the favor of the products being studied, with a lack of rigorous blinding, so that participants were likely nudged to perform better while taking the sports drinks, and measurements of effectiveness that might not be meaningful in real life. So that's an interesting point. It wasn't double blind, wasn't blinded. People then have the placebo effect, it motivates them to want to probably surpass it as well, thinking or believing in themselves having this, superpower.
Absolutely. That's so interesting. Okay, so then on to the next bit. So where marketing meets science. So the marketing around sports drinks rests on a fundamental, seemingly scientific premise that even minor dehydration raises health risks and hinders athletic performance and recovery. But this idea appears overstated. It's more marketing than science. And it's actually interesting that like those two factors. So raises health risk and hinders athletic performance. And I wonder whether one came before the other, right? Okay. As in, it's bad for your performance, which means it has health risks, right? So you put even more emphasis on why you need to improve.
Or possibly just like health risks related to like being extremely dehydrated, right? Because like obviously extreme dehydration has a health risk. But it's like if you're in an environment where, so for example, if you're in a desert and you've just run a marathon and you have no source of water, you're a fucking idiot. You're going to die. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
That is extreme health risk. But if you're somebody who's just done the same thing, but you've finished and you've got access to water, it's not a health risk. But technically, if you took the biological test, you'd both be at a major health risk because you're both really severely dehydrated and you need water immediately. But the difference is most people in the real world have access to water. So it's not unhealthy.
And most people aren't such fucking idiots that they're going to run a marathon in the boiling hot sun.
But you get what I'm trying to say, right? It's
absolutely, yeah.
It's not taking into account that. Like, everything is technically a health risk to some degree, depending upon the context. You know, if I'm in a jungle without a gun and I know there's bears, it's more risky than if I was there with a gun, or if I'm just not in the bloody jungle at all. You know, it's
are bears in the jungle?
I don't know. I'm making it up.
Yeah, no, I get you. So furthermore, athletes who lose the most body mass during marathons, ultra marathons, and Ironman triathlons are usually the most successful, which suggests that fluid losses are not as tightly linked to performance as sports drinks makers claim. Instead, the results imply that there must be some tolerable range for dehydration that doesn't impair performance. You've got well-meaning researchers looking for ways to help athletes cope with the heat, and they find a related but different problem that over time becomes the new center of attention. Good intentions, nudges, perhaps by commercial interest, come together to create a paradigm that holds hydration as paramount. And I think that's really interesting, this idea how it creates this paradigm, and then everyone builds on top of it with loads of other just kind of products, and then it becomes a given, right? Because it kind of preys on this mentality that we've talked about, especially with like high performance athletes that want that edge, right? So they want there to be a product that does this, and so it preys on that, and then it kind of just filters down, and everyone else is like, well, if they're doing it, then it must be, like, they're professionals, right?
And the placebo effect might be helping them create an expectation within themselves, which then actually motivates and encourages them to perform better.
Yeah, precisely. So electrolyte supplements have become another easy way for people to make money off of vulnerable athletes by selling them something that costs virtually nothing to make. It's literally like salty water or something like that.
Technically, yes.
Yeah. Is that most of what we hear about hydration comes from companies and researchers with vested interest in making it all seem complex and highly scientific. The ACSM, NSCA, and NATAA all receive funding from sports drink makers, and so do some of their members. From a biological perspective, it's hard to imagine that the human body is so delicate that it can't function properly without scientists or football stars swooping in with calculators to tell us how to keep it running properly. And it's just such a good point. Like, once again, we go back to the basics. We go back to like how we've evolved. We haven't evolved to need some kind of drink at our disposal before, during, and after,
But your body even makes you feel thirsty, so you then drink. Like, you don't need to be told you need to drink. But I guess you need to be told to drink something very special. This is the special secret to success. It's the same pitch a million times over, isn't it? It's just like, this is the secret to this desired result, and all it takes is minimal effort, but your cash.
God, it's just crazy.
Which kind of goes a very cynical lens on today. I'm feeling on a major rant today.
I love it.
So how to hydrate. So athletes are told to drink before they're thirsty because they lose fluids through sweat before their thirst will compel them to drink. And even small amounts of fluid loss seem detrimental to health and performance. The problem with this model of hydration is that it overlooks basic physiology. It turns out your body is highly adapted to cope with losing multiple liters of fluid, especially during exercise. When you exercise, you lose fluid and salts through sweat, and that translates into a small change in what's called your plasma osmolality, I think. Osmolality. Oh my God.
Oh God, I don't know.
Oh God, Jesus Christ. Have I done like a typo there? Anyway, plasma something. The concentration, which is the concentration of salts and other soluble compounds in your blood. People always worry that they're going to be dehydrated, when the reality is it's much easier to overhydrate because our bodies are so good at conserving water. I thought that's a huge point. So good at conserving water. Of course, we're so good at conserving water because we're made up of water, and obviously it's a very scarce, or it was a scarce resource. So we've probably been trained over millions of years to hold on to water as much as we possibly can, right?
Yeah. And if we tie that into what we were talking about with Exercise by Dan Lieberman, the idea of this persistent hunting, right? That we've evolved to basically run for fucking hours or like do a light jog to basically outrun an animal until it it can't sweat anymore. And that's when we kill it. If we had to stop every 5 minutes for a fucking drink, I don't think that we would be around today, would we? You know?
Literally. True. So being a little hydrated, it's not a bad thing. Our bodies can handle it. Because of the way the body adapts to fluid loss, the common advice to drink lots of fluid in advance of a big event, like a marathon, may actually backfire. If you drink a bunch of excess water leading up to a competition, you prime your body to become less adept at holding on to precious fluids. I thought this was quite interesting, this idea of like sort of water fasting, so to speak. But like if you're somebody who drinks a lot of water, then you lose your ability to hold on to it as well, because obviously you need to excrete it, right? Obviously through urine, but I guess you might even sweat more if you're got more water, because your body's like, I need to get rid of this as quick as possible, or not as quick as possible, but I've got excess amounts. I need to reduce the excess, you know?
Yeah. No, so absolutely.
Go.
Sorry, go. No, go.
No, I was going to continue with the book summary. So if you've got a point, add it.
I was just going to say, I just think it really hammers home this point of being in tune with the mechanisms. It will touch on it in a sec, but this idea of like, you know, when your mechanisms, your biological processes are trying to keep you in homeostasis, right? And trying to keep a balanced level. In this case, a balanced level of like hydration. And it's only when it sends a signal, right? Like it makes so much sense. It's going to send a signal to your brain to tell you that you are thirsty. That is when your biology, that is when your body is literally saying, okay, now we need water. It's been evolved for millions of years. And now it will say, okay, now I'm thirsty. This is when you drink water. And we should be listening to that. And yet we've become so out of tune because we hear some external prompt saying, oh yeah, no, you need to be drinking water. I know when you need to be drinking water, which is just crazy. Yeah, it's nuts. Anyway, sorry, go on.
No. So when you're very hydrated, your body doesn't need to activate many aquaporins, and over time it reduces the number in reserve. So I believe that's the areas that you lose water through, meaning you'll have fewer of these water straws at the ready when you need them. On the other hand, if you practice conserving water by waiting until you're feeling pretty thirsty to drink, your body will adapt by directing more aquaporins to stand by. Instead of prehydrating, Nep said it might actually be better for athletes to practice conserving water in training and continue to simply drink to thirst before an event, rather than trying to top off their fluids. It's funny because that's like a bit of advice I've had as well, like make sure you're hydrated before you exercise. But I feel like sometimes what that does is it almost insinuates that you're not hydrated enough through the natural mechanism of thirst, that you then overdrink, right? And then you lose performance based on it. Yeah. So I don't know about you, but I've found sometimes if I drink too much, I actually feel ill if I run. A full stomach of water, right? So,
absolutely.
Yes. And then the very last note I took on this, which was quite interesting, was this pea color charts, because I've always used the color of my pea to tell when I'm hydrated. And then she's basically saying, if you look at the color of your pee, it's actually bullshit. Or not bullshit, but you can also forget those pee charts that look like paint swatches for urine and ignore anyone who says that yellow pee is a sign you need to drink more water. If you think about hydration from the standpoint of what's going on inside your body, it's easy to see why urine hue isn't helpful. The color of your pee is essentially just a measure of how concentrated your urine is. If it's got more waste than water, it looks dark. And if it is mostly water, it's light or almost clear. But that's not what's important. What you really need to know is what's going on in your blood, and your urine can't tell you that. And that makes a lot of sense. I do get she is kind of saying though that technically then if your pee is very clear, you are drinking too much because it hasn't had the time to build up the concentration of products you need to excrete, right? In my head at least. Yeah. So she's kind of debunking it, but at the same time, she's almost providing evidence to why it would be the case that if you wee really clearly, you're probably weeing too frequently because you haven't had time to build up, toxins, I guess. I don't really know what to call waste products, I think.
I guess.
But I don't know about you, but every day I wake up, sorry to bother the listeners, but I always have like a really like a dark pee in comparison to the rest of the day, right? Because overnight you've had time to build up the reserves of the waste products for then so like it's highly concentrated. Whereas if you drink a lot of water throughout the day and you're peeing frequently, you haven't had time to build up the concentration, right? So
exactly. Like I guess your kidneys are filtering water and taking those kind of waste products and then send it onto your urine essentially, or make it into urine. But what's interesting is like, I feel like, or at least my basic understanding would be that, oh, you drink water, it flushes all your toxins through your kidneys, and then you produce, and so it almost speeds up the process with which toxins are accumulated. But I don't think that's obviously the case, because why would that? Why, water can go through it quicker, but maybe other toxins aren't accumulated at the same rate. And so
I think there's like probably a rate of accumulation, right, based upon your digestion speed or whatever, or the byproducts of your metabolism in my head as well, right? Because waste products can be the waste products of your metabolism, and therefore maybe even if you went for a run, you're more likely to have a darker color pee afterwards because you've accumulated lots of metabolic waste products or whatever you want to call them.
Yeah, exactly. And it's so essentially, if you've got like a really light colored pee, you might just be pissing out water, and while those toxins are still accumulating, it's just they haven't accumulated in the kidneys yet to be passed on.
So I think it was interesting, isn't it? Because I've always used that as like a by proxy for like, I drank too much water because my right. But I think maybe the best way of saying it then is the frequency of the amount you go to the table.
Probably.
Like if you're peeing a lot, then like I assume you probably drank too much water.
Yeah.
Sorry if that's loud. I'm sitting down because my legs are beginning to hurt.
All right. Well, then on to chapter 3. So the perfect fuel. And this is to do with, what was this one to do with?
Recovery shakes. This is the metabolic window. Yes, you're right. It's the beginnings of needing protein and carbohydrates specifically within a time frame after working out. So like you said, the anabolic window.
Yeah, so the rise of recovery shakes. So to recover from their extended effort, cyclists riding the Tour needed carbohydrates to replenish their muscle glycogen stores, protein to help repair muscle damage, and calories, lots of calories. In 1998, a New Jersey company called Pacific Health Laboratories began touting a study that purported to show that their sports drink improved endurance performance by 55% compared to Gatorade. Not only that, the product was also said to improve recovery and might even protect against exercise-induced muscle damage. Got a lot of claims. While Gatorade had been sold as a beverage to quaff during exercise to maintain performance and hydration, Endurox R4 was presented as a new kind of replenishment, a beverage to boost recovery after exercise. The drink was the brainchild of Pacific Health Laboratories founder Robert Portman and another sports scientist, John Ivey, from the University of Texas. It was already well known that exercise depleted the muscle's energy stored in the form of glycogen, and consuming carbohydrates after that exercise was important to help replenish it. But starting in the 1980s, Ivey's research had implied that this recovery process could be enhanced if carbohydrates were ingested immediately after exercise instead of waiting until later. The rate of glycogen stores was twice as fast when you provided it immediately post-exercise, Ivey says, because muscles become extra sensitive to insulin following exercise. As a result, they seem to take up carbohydrate and store it as glycogen much more effectively immediately after a workout. That was Ivey's first insight. The second centered on the need for protein too.
See, this is what I love about this book is it gives you the history of the stuff we take for granted now, like the protein shakes.
It really does.
I've been taking protein shakes for a while, or like recovery shakes or whatever, and I've seen them before. Like they have like 4-to-1 carb to protein ratios, and they have all sorts of like, once again, numbers to give it like scientific validity. But just to understand actually where the product originated from, and the problem they were trying to solve, and like the fact that, quite funny as well with a lot of this, there's like one study that starts it all, or one hypothesis or idea, and then they're like, oh my god, like let's run away with this idea right now, this kind of makes sense, let's create products around it, without ever, like you said before, fully testing the idea. They kind of run away with the marketing, create commercial interests around it, and then they have an interest to not pursue the truth. They have an interest then to pursue the proof of what they've already created a product around, right?
Exactly. And it's just, it's once again, what we were talking about, how, these paradigms, they're created by more and more of these kind of like products being layered on top, right? So before this, Gatorade was like, during a game, you need this, okay? You can't hydrate well enough yourself, and so you need something to top up your stores. And now it's like, okay, well, it's not just that. There's an element, there's a window afterwards, right? And so it starts to create this whole kind of paradigm that like timing is really important, and that, you know, you're not good enough at knowing when you should be eating food. This is telling you when the optimal time is. And it's just so interesting to see the kind of progression of these kind of the ways that we understand recovery. Because everyone knows that, like, oh yeah, straight away I come back from the gym, I take a fucking protein shake. It's just like so ingrained because everyone
it is
does
100%.
it, everyone believes it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, that's a really good point, actually. How the paradigm sort of, you know, evolved from, you know, replenishing electrolytes to now. You're right. There's like a now a new paradigm, like you're saying, of a very specific time frame. And if you miss out on the time frame, you're missing out on potential recovery gains, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
And that obviously is quite anxiety inducing if you're somebody who's put all the effort into fitness. Oh, like, you know, if I don't eat within 2 hours of working out, I'm going to lose my gains. And you know, from at least the people we've been listening to, we know that's just not the case. And as we'll find out in a minute, the studies that were showing this are once again misinterpreted, misdone, I guess you could say. But So the metabolic window of opportunity. At least one study had suggested that taking protein supplements after exercise increased the rate of amino acid uptake and resulted in a faster rate of protein synthesis. Giving exercisers protein immediately after a bout of exercise instead of waiting several hours seemed to speed its uptake in a manner similar to what they'd seen with carbohydrate. The lesson seemed clear. Timing mattered. Portman and Ivy contended that after exercise, there is an interval they called the metabolic window of opportunity, when recovery could be accelerated by ingesting the correct nutrients. They dubbed this concept nutrient timing. I also just want to jump in quickly. It's quite interesting when, like, there is like also an incentive within science for people to name and claim ideas.
Yeah,
so they've noticed something here. They coined a term. It adds power, right? When you can coin a term for something instead of calling it, like, if you describe it, it's not as sexy as like a one word to like nail the system. So what they've done here as well is make it sound really obviously scientific and complex by just like naming it. But really, like, the anabolic opportunity window is just like the timing to eat after you exercise. You know, it's not really any. It's just that's like the idea, but just packaged up in like a really sexy scientific sounding, you know.
No, absolutely. And I think on top of that is like, it kind of implies that because it's never come about before, that you're the only one who knows it, right? And if you're the only one who knows it, then you're the expert, and people can't argue as much unless
well, you're the founder of this like new paradigm. You're the founder of this concept idea. You know,
exactly.
It's like you kind of own it. It's like you're the the person people need to come to for this advice. Which is always why it's good to be first to name things, I guess. So
exactly.
According to Portman and Ivy, taking in the right combination of nutrients during the anabolic phase could boost the rate of muscle glycogen storage, reduce muscle damage, raise the amount of protein taken up by the muscle, and accelerate recovery. Portman was formerly an ad man, having previously founded 2 medical advertising and communication agencies, and he knew the power of marketing, which I also think is a very interesting. Like, the fact that he was an ad man and was part of this like move is interesting. Like, you know, you like this is coincidence. I think not, maybe. Endurox R4 appears to be the first drink marketed specifically for recovery, and its makers use science to make their case. Their studies put volunteers through some form of intense exercise to deplete muscle glycogen stores, then had them drink either Endurox or water. After a period of rest, participants would be exercise tested again. What we saw was an immense improvement in the subsequent exercise. But as you find out, there's probably reasons for that, you know. So the new recovery paradigm. With the marketing of Power Bar, Endurox R4, and similar products, a new paradigm emerged. If you want to achieve peak performance, you need a special nutritional formula delivered at precisely the right time. Soon, athletes from a wide range of sports were rushing to refuel within the metabolic window, lest they miss out on a chance to enhance recovery and muscle adaptations. Portman and Ivy's book spread the notion of nutrient timing, but the idea was popularized and commercialized before all the details were worked out. Once again, rushing into the idea and promotion of the idea before, you know, figuring out if it's true or not. The problem with nutrient timing is that it suggests a sense of urgency and precision that is not held up in subsequent research. That carbs and protein are important for recovery is pretty certain, but the optimal amount and timing is less so. But yeah.
It's
you want to
it's so interesting. No, I was but I just think it's interesting that, like, you know, before people even dive into this kind of like a certain gap in the market, right? It's like, first of all, the first person jumps in and kind of starts to create this paradigm, and then all these other products, when they are layered on top, they can only really, there's not as much of a gap anymore, and so they're always just like, capitalism is just competition. And so, you know, what was it saying, the thingy bar, which was it,
well, in my head as well, maybe they wanted to jump on it because obviously the scientific research was just becoming well known. They're like, shit, if we don't jump on this opportunity right now, we're going to miss out, right?
Yeah, and then you have an escalation of like, oh well, this bar is better than Endurox R4, right? Yeah. And then, oh, this product is better than this power bar, and so you start to have this escalation within this gap, right? So first of all, the gap wasn't even there, right? There isn't such thing as this kind of nutrient timing. Then it's created. And then within that gap, it's like escalated, where now it's like probably the, like, you know, the most sought after product is claiming that this is how much it can improve it, when in reality it's not doing anything, right? It's just interesting how it kind of escalates.
And they have different formulas and like different amino acid blends, and they're all using different.
Exactly, yeah.
So I mean, this is the state of affairs now. I mean, I don't know if it was like that back then, but they've created
I don't think it was
metrics for differentiation, right? Like the ideal amount, 24 grams of protein, that's like, you know, proven scientifically to be the amount you need, or, you know, this amino acid blend with taurocine, whatever, this is the one you need. You know, it's it is interesting. Definitely. I just find it's very interesting how, like, you know, they just, obviously competitive demands, they found you know, something like, it started in my head from really good intentions. Like they wanted to figure out how to recover quicker, right? Yeah. What happens, I think, is when you start getting commercial interest involved, it changes the value equation from like figuring out what's actually true and what can actually help to, you know, what's commercially viable more, or like you start caring about the commerciality of the product over the actual truth. And I think that it's probably a part of the equation, is the fact that truth, obviously, as we discussed with these scientific studies, is so hard to determine. And obviously these guys don't have time to rigorously study stuff for like 5 years. They need to get it out there. And like, you know, any promising amount. And to be fair, like, there is something to be said for, like, let's just say somebody comes up with a cure or potential cure for cancer. Should that be fast tracked over other stuff? Because obviously there's the potentiality of it. And I'm not saying obviously growing muscles have got like some comparison to it, but it's like, when things show promise, I think there is a level of, like, you know, speeding up the process of creating a product to fix these demands or to help with these things. But it's just, and when it becomes,
to not lose out, right?
Yeah, to not lose out on the potential benefits.
It's like it's the next big thing. It's like we've got to jump on it straight away, right?
So like, like with this, we're kind of berating these people, but at the same time, I kind of understand where they stand with it as well, especially if they thought they found out the best new thing. Like, oh my god, I don't. No part of me doubts that they did believe the original idea, you know.
Exactly. And I think it can come from different points. You know, it can be like they had good intentions, and then it just went awry, and then it was like, you know, it got out of control, and before you can't tame it or bring it back in. The genie's out of the bottle, essentially. But yeah, no, it's 100%. It's not always nefarious or always started with malicious intent. But yeah, so does this window exist? Well, in 2013, Brad Schoenfield, director of the Human Performance at lab at CUNY Lehman College in the Bronx, and his colleagues published a meta-analysis looking into the evidence behind the idea of post-exercise anabolic window. They concluded that the evidence didn't suggest the existence of a narrow window. Part of the problem is that the original research looked at the response to a high dose of protein following exercise and compared it to a placebo. That's not a proper design, Schoenfield says. If your question is about the timing, you shouldn't compare a dose of protein given at one time to no protein given at all. Instead, you need to compare the same doses of protein given at different times. When Schoenfield's team did that with a study looking at what happened if exercisers took protein right before versus right after a workout, they found no difference. There's surely a period where your body needs protein to repair and build after a muscle straining workout, particularly something like a max session in the weight room, a CrossFit workout, or a high intensity interval session. But it's not so much an anabolic window, Schoenfield says. It's an anabolic barn door. I like the analogy.
Yeah.
But nutrient timing wasn't only about protein. Prolonged and or intense exercise depletes glycogen stores in the muscles, and you need carbohydrates to restore them. Glycogen does seem to get replenished rapidly if you take in carbs immediately after the workout, says Schoenfield. But here's the rub. If you're not going to train again until the next day, there's zero relevance. Schoenfield's analysis showed that as long as you take in some carbohydrates, your glycogen stores will be similarly replenished whenever you consume those carbs 20 minutes after your workout or 3 or 6 hours later. On the other hand, if you're training again in a few hours, then by all means replenish your energy ASAP. But know that the reason to do is that you're going to need the fuel again soon, not because waiting will impair your recovery. And I thought that bit was just so interesting. This idea that it doesn't matter. The timing doesn't matter because most people aren't training twice a day. If you are, you're probably an elite athlete, or
in which case you probably do need these carbs to then train
exactly.
in, right?
Yeah.
So once again, it's a mixed use case, right? Like we're almost being peddled stuff that only like elite athletes really need.
And that's the thing; it's context dependent, right? It's like most of these things that apply to these, elite athletes. I mean, they're literally doing this as their job. I mean, imagine having a job where it's literally to work out and perform and, to improve on whatever sport or whatever you're doing. And so naturally their demands are slightly different to, if you're going to the gym once a day.
Exactly. I guess once again, the problem is it's kind of being promoted as, this very short time frame that you need carbohydrates to replenish your muscle stores. But it's like, that also makes logical sense, right? You're not going to need to use your muscles till the next time you work out. Therefore, as long as you replenish those storages before the next time you work out, then you're going to be fine, right? Why is there like a time frame? I mean, I guess you could argue, and I think what I heard Andy Galpin argue is there's increased stimulus after you've worked out, right? Like your muscles, because you've just worked them out, they're screaming like, give me nutrients. Like that would make sense. And then over time, their like signals would be weaker because maybe something else is bothering the body now, That's the only thing I could reason that would make sense for like a specific timing. But once again, like at the same time, if they're damaged and they're not going to stop signaling until they've been repaired. That's a faulty design system, right? It's like, we're broken now. Let's just stop screaming because we're not going to get the nutrients. It's like, I don't think that's how it works. Otherwise, people just be destroyed,
Like, I can't imagine, hunter-gatherers, like, as soon as they kill fucking gazelle, they just eat it right then and there. Rather than
That's so true,
Yeah, funny.
So the next section is there a science of recovery? So what makes the metabolic window of opportunity and recovery branded products so appealing is that they promise to distill recovery to an exact scientific formula. But this precision is also what makes the claims dubious. The promises get ahead of the science. They're not entirely false, they're just overstated. This tendency to overstate is an ongoing problem in sports nutrition, says Louise Burke, head of sports nutrition at the Australian Institute of Sport. I'm sure a lot of the people doing it aren't being malicious, like as we said, or deliberately misleading. But often when we try to market ourselves to athletes, even for the best purposes, we add a bit of pizzazz. When your muscles are hungry for fuel, they don't care where the energy comes from, says Brent Ruby, the University of Montana scientist who supervised the cyclist study. The muscle couldn't care less. Couldn't care less if you're dumping in carbohydrates. The muscle's going to be satisfied. Even so, we're still left with the burning question: what should I eat after exercising? The easiest answer is whatever your body is hungry for. What becomes clear when you look at the history of sports nutrition is that what's considered the perfect food to go with exercise is determined as much by culture and tradition as by science. Today, Jennifer Maxwell says those preferences have changed. Natural products and ones that appear less processed are favoured over ones that contain long ingredient lists and additives. Our definitions of what constitutes healthy and desirable foods have shifted over time. Sometimes this happens in response to new research, but food fads and changing marketing trends contribute too. We all seem to be suckers for superfoods, whether it's an old standby like the PB&J, a rebranded staple like chocolate milk, or a newly discovered item like cherry juice. We're all looking for the magic bullet, the special ingredient or compound that will give us an edge, and advertisers are standing by, ready to provide it.
I think that's. I thought that was so interesting. I thought there was also a bit in the book where it was talking about Usain Bolt and how he was just sick of eating such healthy food at the Olympics, so he would just go to
like
McDonald's
KFC
and eat like
chicken
nuggets every day. And I think it's a good point. It's like, okay, yes, in an ideal world, you probably should eat probably non-processed foods, because also they probably are harder on your gut, harder to digest. But essentially, if your body is screaming out for nutrients because you've just done an intense workout, then it's probably not going to be that picky. And it's probably also an accumulative effect that negatively impairs you, right? It's like a compound aspect.
Yeah.
If you're eating
100%.
chicken nuggets every day, and that's the only food that you're eating to overcome something, then it will probably start to impair you. But once again, if it's a one-off, it's probably not that bad, right?
It's the same with the beer, what we were saying earlier. If you have 2 beers after every single time you do exercise, and you do that every day of the week, you're probably going to have some detrimental effect. But if you do it once, like you just said, once in a blue moon, I don't see a massive issue.
Yeah.
So
So last point here. So the power of listening to your body. In today's world, athletes often rely on apps or scientific formulas to guide their diet, but it's essential to develop the skill of listening to one's body. Hunger, just like thirst, is an intuitive indicator of what the body needs. While more research is needed, periodizing nutrition seems to be a promising approach where emphasis is given to promoting adaptation during pre-season and replenishment during the competition season. Our bodies are adaptable machines designed to maintain homeostasis by adjusting to changes in our environment. We don't need to maintain a perfect balance of inputs. Instead, we need to understand our body's needs and adapt accordingly. And once again, this really hammers home this point that, when you're hungry, your body will send a signal to say that it's hungry, right? Which means that it's probably depleted of its stores and so needs to replenish. The same thing when you're thirsty is it knows when it's thirsty. Someone else telling you when you're thirsty or when you're hungry or when you should eat isn't more reliable. It's not calibrated to your body and your bodily functions or mechanisms. So you need to kind of start to calibrate that and be more in tune with yourself so that you can really start to respond appropriately when you get these kind of signals, essentially.
Yeah. It's an interesting one on a kind of side note to do with hunger. So sometimes hunger can betray people. So when we get onto the book, Why We Get Fat, he talks a lot about how when you have the genes which promote obesity, what actually happens is your fat cells basically become malignant and they pull in all the glucose from your bloodstream. So that makes you hungrier. Because you're basically, when you eat, you feed your fat cells and not your body. Yeah. So you're always hungry. And that makes you fatter. So basically, it's funny because obviously in this context,
no, I get you.
Hunger is a good thing to listen to, right? Except, if you're really overweight, and then it's probably not a good idea to listen to your hunger. And that's because your body is essentially, your fat cells are they kind of got a mind of their own, basically. And they're just pulling in all the glucose and fattening themselves up at the expense of the rest of your body, which is crazy to think. It's and obviously listen to your body, but that's because your body's out of balance at that point, right? Bad eating have caused this imbalance, so to speak.
Yeah, and I think in the context of doing physical exercise, right? There's a difference between your body telling you you're thirsty when you've just run a marathon compared to when you're just normally thirsty. And I reckon there's a difference in the psychological association between hunger and thirst signals post or around in the context of physical exercise, and then just normal signals. I mean, if you engage in a lot of sugar, if you eat a lot of sugar, then you're going to be your hunger is going to go through the roof, right? And
because it's short-lived. It's short-lived, isn't it? Because obviously it's so digestible, it disappears within 20 minutes. You're I'm hungry again because I haven't sufficiently,
And as we'll get onto it, as we talked about last week with the World's Fittest Book, sleep impacts, the hormones ghrelin and leptin. I think it's leptin. I can't remember. Which basically, change how much your satiety, so like, you know, how hungry you are and your appetite. And so that can also, if you're sleep deprived, that can make you even more hungry. And so those signals are kind of out of whack, right? And like you just said, it's like, you know, when they're not calibrated, when they're not, you know, balanced, then it can start to send you off kilter.
Yeah, then you can't trust your signals as much. Yeah,
exactly.
So we're moving
Cool.
into chapter 4. We might have to stop a bit earlier than when I planned, just because it's, you know, it's
That's fine.
juicy book, to be fair. So chapter 4, the Cold War, rice, rest, ice compression, elevation. Icing is a popular method for coping with pain, particularly in the sporting world. The practice gained traction after physician Gabe Merkin introduced the term rice, rest, ice compression, elevation in his 1978 book, the sports medicine book. Icing is intended to speed up the body's healing process by redirecting blood and inflammatory cells away from the injured area. Today, ice packs and cold baths have become ubiquitous in athletic training facilities, sold in drugstores and used by athletes in every sport. Despite the initial pain, icing is believed to reduce soreness and aid recovery. The discomfort associated with icing may add to its perceived effectiveness in a culture that values grit and equates pain with gain. And this chapter was interesting. We talked about it, I think.
It really was,
haven't we? Because I don't know about you, but throughout my childhood as well, you know, I've had injuries where or like rolled over my ankle and then immediately had put ice on it. You know, I still remember at school going to like the sand and getting put, you know, ice packs put on stuff. Like, wow, like if this is the case where this isn't as effective as people think, you are literally causing more harm than good. Like.
No, or just like postponing it, right? It's almost you are literally dealing, like, you know, when they talk about, you know, things dealing with the symptom and not the root cause, you are literally doing that in this case, because
you're treating pain.
There's this inflammation process and you're just getting rid of it, or so that it will come back later.
100%. It's once again, it's another, what do you call it? Like egotistical thing where we think we are smarter than nature. Like, the fact that when you injure yourself, there's an inflammatory process, okay? And that's painful, right? It's like, okay, right, we need to stop the inflammatory process. But why? Like, the whole point of the inflammatory process is to heal you. So, like, by stopping the inflammatory process, you're slowing down the potential to heal, essentially. I mean, if the logic, like, goes like that. But it would make sense, like, that the body would create an inflammatory process to create pain to stop you from using the area again, because you need to recover and you need to repair, right? Like,
also, I don't know why we would think that mechanism we would need to like turn off, right? Like, it's like, oh no, it's going into it's you know, it's causing this.
This is where our senses betray us. It's painful. We want to turn it off because it's painful in my head.
Well,
that's the only, like, think about it. It's the only kind of reason. Like, oh, you've injured yourself, right? Apply ice, and then you feel better. So because you sense that it feels better, you think you are better, and it's like it's literally like that, isn't it?
But once again, I wonder whether that's, you know, based on our association to what pain means, right? Like, we've talked about this a lot in, like, you know, just even on a societal level, of the idea of like harm or stress and how it's actually quite good for you. And in this case, you know, like, pain is literally telling you that something is wrong and you shouldn't kind of use it in the case of, you know, an injury. And it's just quite interesting that, like, you know, I wonder whether because we constantly try to avoid pain, that's where this kind of attitude towards, you know, getting rid of it as quickly as possible, rather than seeing it as something that's kind of being helpful. I definitely think it comes into play with it, right? It's kind of, you know, if somebody goes into doctors and go like, oh my God, I've injured my ankle, it really hurts. They usually give you painkillers, right? And like, either that's the thing,
through tablets or through, you know, applying ice. But the reality, we never asked the question of, is the pain there to guide us for something? And the reality probably is, yes, it is. It's there to guide us, to let us know we've injured ourselves and that we shouldn't use this area or shouldn't put any you know, pressure through this area for the next few days until it's recovered, right? In my head.
Well, the same, no, exactly. The same thing goes for like when people have fevers. Like, the fever is literally your body's way of trying to get rid of whatever it is by putting up the temperature of your body, right? And yet, you know, lots of people will take I don't know, what are they, like Nurofen and things like that, to kind of reduce their fever, which is literally fighting against the body's ability. It's like, essentially what's happening here is like you're fighting against inflammation, which is trying to repair the body. And we're trying to counteract that process. So anyway, the case against ice, this next bit. So initially, icing was thought to be beneficial as it could suppress inflammation. And that once again talks about, like, what was our association or our understanding of inflammation at the time. However, in recent years, there has been change of perspective, and some experts now denounce the method they once championed. Dr. Gabe Merkin, a popularizer of the Rice method, now believes that instead of promoting healing and recovery, icing might actually impair it. This change of heart was due in large part of the work of Gary Renal, who argues that inflammation is the body's way of healing and that icing only delays this response. So the Rice method, that is kind of what we were taught, especially in like PE, was that rest, ice, compression, elevation.
Elevation. I remember even learning that in PE.
Yeah, literally. So muscle soreness after an intense workout is a common and painful after effect that triggers a repair response in the body. The cleanup and repair process is essentially the inflammation process, which is necessary for healing. Renal argues that icing delays the healing process, as it only slows down blood flow to the area without halting it indefinitely. Once the icing stops and the blood flow returns to normal, whatever process the icing was trying to hinder will proceed again, and the swelling will continue and the inflammation will start.
Like,
despite Renal's argument,
so obvious.
It is. It really is. It's just, and once again, it's like once your kind of conceptualization of something shatters, you're like, why did we believe in that? Like, it just doesn't make sense. Despite Renal's argument, icing remains popular. The new cooling devices such as ice sleeves and cuffs are being promoted on social media.
But it just makes sense, doesn't it? So if the mechanism that it was working by was slowing down blood flow and reducing inflammation, of which the inflammation then comes back once you stop icing, and then you allow it to continue, the only thing you've done is slowed down that process, of which you start feeling better, not because you feel better because of the ice, but you feel better like 5 days later once you've let the sort of inflammation die down because it's done its fixing. It's weird. But to be fair, there is a point, and I quite like this part because she actually goes into the case for ice, because there is a specific reason to use ice. So the case for ice, there are two competing theories about cold therapy and icing. One theory suggests that it could stunt the body's adaptation to training by decreasing inflammation, while the other theory argues that it could reduce pain and soreness and allow athletes to train harder and sooner. It's not yet clear which theory is correct, and it may depend on the specific circumstances. So experts suggest that recovery may be the most effective when done in a periodized manner, matching recovery techniques to the goals of specific training. So based on current evidence, ice baths are not recommended after strength training or during building phase of training. However, they may be useful for short-term recovery in between events where long-term adaptations are not a concern. So if you're doing sport the next day and you need to be fit and ready, reducing inflammation to reduce having pain is probably a good idea, because it will allow you to train harder or compete harder than if you let the inflammation settle in and then you'll be unable to train. Like, I have this all the time with playing football on the weekend. Like, I play on the Friday and the Sunday. The day after, my legs, my ankles, my joints are just absolutely screwed because of just the amount of pressure I'm putting through it. And I'm realizing now that it's just the inflammation response telling me, don't do that again today. It's just it's like a signal to me, relax. Like, it even hurts sometimes to walk, especially when you get out of bed in the morning. It's just like, hang on a second, Jess. Like, calm it down. And like, it just makes sense to. Like, for me, if I then compress it, put some cold on it, and then run again, I'm running the risk in my head, at least, of further injuries or worse injuries, because I've stopped the healing process to reduce the pain to allow me to compete again. But I can imagine if you did this every day for a long period of time, you probably would end up with an injury. And I wonder if that's how some people actually get injured in sports, because they injure themselves, they use this ice treatment, they think they're feeling better, they go out, they compete again, and then they injure themselves because they didn't have the signals from the inflammation and the pain to tell them, hang on a second, you shouldn't be doing this. And I just wonder how many injuries are being caused actually through that. Because if it is the case, it doesn't surprise me if people have actually, should have been basically saying to themselves, I need to take a few days off here because my knees are screwed. But because you've applied cold, you're like, oh, I'm fine. And then next thing you know, you've done some ligament damage.
Exactly. And I think it probably also depends on like what kind of injury is, there's a difference between just like basic muscle inflammation because you've been working out at the gym, or like something to do with something wrong with your ligament or your tendons, right? And putting ice on it was probably, it's probably worse for like a ligament and like a tendon, right? Because they kind of run the risk that if you continue to work out or use those ligaments or tendons, you've got a higher risk of getting an injury. But yeah, once again, it's context dependent. It's like the same thing with that kind of window for athletes who are working out twice a day. It's like, yeah, okay, well then having carbs and protein before your second bout is probably a good idea. Same thing with this. It's like if you've got another session to get in later on, and you're going to be competing soon, then maybe it is best to go and have an ice bath straight after. But once again, it's like you are running the risk of getting an injury over time.
Yeah.
So,
and then I made a little note here. Yeah, so I made a little note here on the cryotherapy. So, although cryotherapy enthusiasts claim it can significantly cool down the body, a study found that temperature drop recorded on the skin during a whole body cryotherapy was only between -4 and -14, despite the temperatures meant to being -180 degrees at the device outlet. Muscle temperature cooled even less, only around about -1.1 degrees. The study concludes that the difference in temperatures are smaller than those experienced with an ice pack or cold tub. Therefore, despite the low temperature, cryotherapy is more tolerable, which may explain its appeal, than an ice tub because it does not actually cool down the body as much. And I thought that was really interesting because it's an example of where science has kind of taken over and gone like, so the thought is, exposure to cold reduces inflammation. So cryo being obviously super cold, exposing an athlete to that is going to cause them to, reduce inflammation even more. But the reality is, even though they're putting a -180 degree cryotherapy chamber around them, the change in the body temperature is by -1.1 degrees or whatever, and the actual sensation is only -1 degrees or whatever, and it's not painful. So therefore, it's a preferred way of treatment. So instead of finishing a sport and jumping in a freezing cold ice bath, which would be painful to 99% of people apart from Wim Hof, or going in a cryo chamber, people are going to pick the cryo chamber because it's meant to do the same thing, but it's like almost pleasant, I can imagine.
Yeah. But also it's like, funnily enough, this stuff shouldn't be pleasant, right? And I think, what we've kind of been learning from listening to a bit of Andrew Huberman about, cold showers and ice baths and things like that is like, it is that pain shock that almost attributes, and we're talking more the psychological benefits here, but like the increase in dopamine and the change in mindset and the ability to deal with adversity in that kind of degree. And I think so there are multiple benefits to ice baths, but in the context of recovery, it probably isn't ideal to do it after when you have any kind of form of inflammation, because it prohibits that. Yeah, which I just thought was quite interesting. I thought this chapter was really good, actually.
That was good. It was very eye-opening. It was once again, this book was full of myth busting. I mean, especially us now being or having been in the sort of fitness space for years, just like on and off going to the gym and stuff.
Yeah,
just taking an interest in health or fitness or whatever. We've seen all these different approaches. So just to be able to like see them under scientific scrutiny and actual like thinking about the actual mechanisms behind how these things are meant to work or how they are theorized to work, and then realizing that actually kind of some of it doesn't even make sense, right? I just thought, it was a really interesting chapter. Like, I can't believe it. Like putting
because my understanding of inflammation was just clearly wrong. But it's once again, I feel like I was just in a paradigm thinking that it was, I'd been told about it, but I don't remember
information is bad, right? But I think there's an interesting part where people conflate like localized inflammation to injuries to like the chronic inflammation given to you by really bad nutrition. Because I believe there's a thing called like chronic inflammation of your entire like body's organs, depending upon bad metabolic processes from a really bad diet.
Yeah.
So I believe like conflating that is different because you obviously want to reduce the inflammation from that.
Yeah.
But you don't want to reduce the inflammation from a localized area, which is there. Like the sole purpose is there to repair it, right? So like in my head, the chronic inflammation of your whole body is basically saying your whole body is under attack and you have to fix everything in your body, sending signals like the whole body is like under stress. Whereas like a localized inflammation is like this area is under stress and needs repair. So like, that's how I differentiated it in my head. I would love to read, once again, this is another topic we can now possibly explore off the back of this, like just inflammation in general. Like, what is it in terms of the relation of inflammation in a localized area, such as like an injury, versus inflammation in your other areas of your body, right? Because I'm just guessing at the difference here. I don't actually know.
Yeah, no, it'd be interesting thing to go into. Yeah, absolutely.
You can pick up a potential book, and potentially another book we can do as well if people would be interested is the Gary Reinhold book on ice, because he definitely referenced it in the book, or she referenced it in the book. Sorry, and I need to remember the name. I think I put it on my reading list, but I would love to like hear it from the guy himself. Maybe his explanation of what information is, right?
Yeah, but so what I think, to be fair, to give him
the book's called Iced.
Okay,
it's called Iced.
To give him his due, the guy who came up with the term rice, Gabe Merkin, apparently now kind of goes against it and is a big proponent, saying actually it doesn't work. It's going against the information process, because he was like shown that it doesn't, it once again, it goes against the process. And I just thought, I love it when someone who is a big proponent of something, who pushes something and then goes, actually, no, I'm wrong. When someone admits they're wrong and they fall on their sword, I think that's fucking great, especially when,
when his whole life has been built up on it. Like he is the guy who he popularized the term, and he's the guy who's the first to say, actually, I was wrong.
But you need that, right? Because maybe at the time, the scientific literature, and I would be interested to know why, he thought that ice was a good idea. And once again, it's probably because there's that visceral effect, right? You put ice on whatever injury you have, and the pain goes. And so it's like, oh, well, it must be working. And maybe that's where, it's kind of,
maybe just people thought inflammation was bad, and it was like a malignant response to something rather than an actual useful response, right? And to be fair, we're basing our opinions now on the fact that inflammation is actually the response that repairs you. But that might not be the case, and therefore we could be completely wrong, which is why I would love to read this guy's book, Ice, and understand how he proposes that inflammation actually helps, because it's all good just saying inflammation is there to actually help you, but
of course,
unless you can think about the mechanics behind it, you don't really know. But I guess once again, it would just make logical sense, right? Like your body's injured, it needs to repair itself. If it's swelling, it's obviously doing something. Like my understanding was the swelling was to allow fluid with specific molecules in there to come in and help repair it, right? That was my understanding, but that could be wrong. Yeah. But like, then the logic would suffice to saying that, if it's there to help, slowing that down would slow down the helping procedure / fixing procedure, and therefore would be something you would want to avoid if you wanted to repair fully quicker. But if you want to repair with less pain, maybe the best option is the ice,
Yeah, no, exactly.
So I think but the next two chapters are quite short.
Yeah, should we do it? Yeah, let's do it. Let's go.
I think we can finish both of them, to be honest. Yeah.
Yeah. So chapter 5, flushing the blood. So increasing blood flow. Every recovery trick or product is a little different, but a vast number of them aim to boost blood flow. That's with good reason. Blood is the body's great delivery system. It helps get recovery done. It's what shuttles the metabolic byproducts of exercise away from the tissues and brings the inflammatory molecules that help with repairs to the sites that need fixing. Blood also delivers oxygen to cells and glycogen to depleted muscles. The circulatory system is like a big city's transport network. It allows things to get from one part of the body to another. The theory behind training and recovery boils down to this. You stress your body and it responds by fortifying its resources to better handle the stress. You put strain on your muscles by lifting a weight and it fixes this minor damage by reinforcing the muscle fibers so it's stronger for next time. How quickly you rebound from the strain of training by building strength and endurance depends on the amount of stress you experience and the resources you have available to work with. The new focus on recovery recognizes that training is only as good as the recovery that follows it. And you can understand why someone would, see that, well, now what is, how can I boost this system? How can I optimize it?
Well, it makes logical sense, right? Yeah. If you come to rely on a system so heavily, like how can we, like I said, optimize it, make it more efficient or whatever. So then I've got some notes here about the lactic acid because I thought it's quite interesting because I think Andy Galpin talks about this in his podcast with Huberman as well. But, we've all come to believe that lactic acid is something that you need to get rid of immediately. So it's common to think that the soreness generated in your muscles were working out as a buildup of lactic acid, but that thinking was wrong, says Michael Jordan, a Mayo Clinic exercise scientist. Lactic acid, which is made up of a lactate and an acid molecule, is produced in your muscles during heavy exercise, but it turns out that it's probably not responsible for the burn you feel in your legs. In fact, research by George Brooks at the University of California, Berkeley showed that lactate may actually provide a source of fuel for muscles in some cases, and may even help trigger the production of new mitochondria, the structures in cells that produce energy. While it's still true that exercising hard increases lactate levels and lactate buildup, appears to be related to fatigue, the idea that lactate needs to be flushed from the muscles after workout is misguided. Joyner says that lactic acid is removed from muscles very quickly during active recovery. It's gone in less than an hour. Even if you do nothing, it'll go down fairly fast. And I thought this was interesting because I think Andy Galpin brought up the idea that lactate can actually be used as a fuel source.
Yeah.
So yes, that would make sense. That would make sense for why active recovery would reduce your lactate, because if you're doing active recovery where you're doing a less intense workout in that muscle group, your body would probably then use the lactic acid as the energy. Hence why it dissipates quicker. That would make sense.
Yes, because I think it's aerobic. Aerobic can deal with lactic acid, right?
I believe so, and it's built up because of the anaerobic. It's the waste products of the previous energy system, and then it's reusing the waste products in an aerobic fashion, I think. Yeah,
because it creates so much energy within such a short amount of time that it can't get rid of the lactate at the same rate, and so it builds up to a point where then your body is forced to kind of slow down, and then it turns on the aerobic kind of system, and then that can start to deplete the kind of.
I think that is correct. I don't know, but this is another. Yes, this is another thing I really want to kind of get into, and I don't know if that's too granular maybe for some of the book summaries to redo, but the science behind it would be really interesting. And I think Overcoming Gravity might step into it because it talks a lot about the phosphonate system or adenosine, whatever it's called, ATP.
Yeah, I think that's
system
really
and stuff.
interesting actually.
So sorry, I just took that note because it was. Once again, another myth that was busted, because obviously lactate has always been, that burn is the feeling of the lactic acid building up in your muscles, but apparently, that's not true. So,
yeah. Okay, so on to the next bit. So infrared therapy. I've heard about this. It sounded quite funny. There's only one published study that explores the use of infrared saunas for recovery, which is a small exploratory study from Finland. The study tested the use of IFAR infrared sauna following strength exercise and running and found a slight improvement in the specialized jump test compared to the control group. However, this measure may not be relevant to most people, and without further studies, it's not convincing. The term infrared and far infrared are popular buzzwords in the recovery world, often used to describe cold lasers, massage beds, and even expensive pajamas endorsed by football star Tom Brady. However, these claims are mainly based on small studies, some of which are conducted on lab animals. None of these supposed benefits have been definitively confirmed. Some of the claims for infrared saunas, such as reducing swelling, inflammation, and associated pain and expelling toxins from the body, are so unfounded that the FDA has ordered manufacturers making these statements to stop. While infrared radiation is a real thing, the term is often used to give an impression of space-age science to products that are otherwise ordinary.
I quite like that. It reminds me of the cryotherapy a little bit as well. It's this idea of like space, visionary future-based technology products.
Exactly.
Like the appeal is almost in the fact that they're futuristic and that you think they're going to work.
And they're also so complex. They're so beyond your understanding that it's like, wow, how can this come about?
And look at all these claims, so they can reduce toxins, they can do all this. It's just like people forget to ask the question, like, how does it actually do these things? So like they always go like it does this, this, and this, but the question should be like, but how does it do these things? I can't remember if was it this chapter? I didn't think I took the notes for it, but I remember she was speaking to somebody. It was either the cryotherapy or was the infrared. She was actually asking the person who was providing the service the questions like, but how does it work? And the guy was just spieling absolute bullshit to her, being like some sort of system which just like didn't exist or was like the complete opposite to what he's explaining. So she was there like, not only are they like not proven, but this guy is literally just chatting shit. Like he doesn't understand any of the science behind what it's meant to be doing or whatever.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Yeah, it's funny.
So
this next part actually I thought was like quite like because I like massages, right? And once again, there's a huge physical proponent there where surely it must be doing something. You literally have someone massaging every muscle in your body, especially like deep sports massages from like physiotherapists, where, and it's not specifically what she talks about here, I don't think. I think these are more just like standard massage. To be fair, I don't know, but so away with you.
Away with you. Massage is a popular recovery method among athletes, but the evidence for its effectiveness is limited. According to Paul Ingram, a massage therapist and publisher of PainScience.com, most of the popular reasons for why massages are good are unsupported. While it may help with anxiety and depression, there is little evidence that it improves performance or recovery. However, Shauna Howson, an Australian recovery expert, suggests that massage may be effective for short recovery periods of up to 10 minutes. Research conducted by Butterfield on rats suggests that massage shortly after exercise may increase protein synthesis in muscles by providing a mechanical signal to the cells, which could help promote repairs via protein synthesis.
Does that mean that they were massaging rats?
Yeah, that sounds like it, yeah. Like, can you imagine us like as a job? Like, what do you do today? Rats.
I'm a rat massager. a rat masseuse. Oh, God. I wasn't like, when I read that in the book, I was like, what the fuck does that mean? Like,
I don't know. What were they getting, a sports massage? Is that what they're doing?
Yeah,
they're doing
this
old,
poor, like, this
they get the old Taiwanese and they stand on them chairs. And they stand on their back. Good stuff. So this finding is yet to be confirmed in human studies. Despite the limited evidence, many athletes still find that getting a massage helps them become more self-aware and in tune with their bodies. This was the only notes I took, but it did go into a bit more detail, sort of suggesting why there wasn't really an effect, and basically suggesting also that a lot of the claimed effects were sensory based. So, feeling more relaxed the day after, and therefore it was, you perceive that the massage has an effect because you feel more relaxed or you feel different. But once again, this depends on how do you define recovery, right? Because if feeling recovered, which most people would be like, oh, that's the common sense approach, feeling recovered is, the goal or is what recovery is, then maybe it does help recovery. But if performance is what recovery is, so recovering is being able to perform at the same level or better the next day or in the future, then it's a different ballgame, isn't it? It's I just realized we got to this part and we haven't even defined recovery,
Yeah.
But you could go around and, she didn't define recovery, I don't think.
No, exactly.
Just sort of, but I guess all these tests technically, just by looking at what the science does, they define recovery by performance or by, by performance the next day. They don't do it really based on feeling, or they do a tiny bit.
Products probably kind of like, and products probably like move the goalpost a bit, to make their products actually seem legit.
Yeah.
But it was interesting, this massage bit, because then it kind of went on to this to the next bit, which is like foam rollers and massage balls, which I see all the time in gyms. I've got one. I mean, I've got also massage balls, especially for like my feet, for like fasciitis and whatnot. But so I just thought it was quite interesting. So what about those painful massage balls and all the foam rollers that seem to be in all gyms? Many athletes swear by self-massage techniques like foam rolling, which is said to target fascia, the connective tissue that wraps around muscles and tissues like plastic wrap. I didn't know fascia was all over your body, which was interesting. Anatomists used to consider fascia as passive tissue that only provided protection, but recently research has shown that it can actively contract and become stiff. It is possible that the stiffness we feel upon waking up in the morning is due to fascia, although this is just a hypothesis at the moment. The theory behind foam rollers is that they loosen up muscles and may address adhesions between layers of fascia. By pressing and massaging a muscle group with a foam roller, it is thought to work out these adhesions. However, this theory has not been proven yet. Another theory is that applying compression to muscles with a foam roller sends a signal to brain which tells it to decrease muscle excitability and relax muscle tone. This could lead to a better range of motion in the muscle. While there is some evidence that foam rolling after exercise reduces muscle soreness, it is unclear whether this is due to a change in perception or a physiological change in the muscle. As research continues, we may gain a better understanding of the physiology behind why massage and foam rolling makes us feel better. And I just thought that's quite interesting because Yeah, it's just another thing that is just a given, or that I had as a given, that like helps with any kind of like muscle knots or whatnot. Yeah, really interesting.
It's really interesting that it's like undecided, and that, you know, even the best theories haven't been proven yet.
And also, I wonder if, like, you know, when you're doing studies on these kinds of things, right? Like, recovery may not be like, is it localized to a specific area? I mean, like, if I've got knots in my muscles on my back, right, compared to someone who doesn't, and then we both have a massage, and that's part of the scientific study. I mean, like, who's going to benefit? If he doesn't benefit because he doesn't have anything to like kind of recover from, then, or he doesn't have to recover as much.
It's a very good point.
And I guess that's another point, right? Like, how much do you have to recover? And like, we all have individual differences. We all strain the body or stress the body to different degrees.
Yeah, we have different, as we found out from the sports gym, we all have different responses to training, right? Like different responses to the stimulus that are imposed on us. So, which is actually
it's such an interesting, like, because how can you standardize it? You don't have a baseline of recovery.
You can't. This is what I mean. This is why when I was saying earlier on, I just don't see there's any solution to some of these problems, right? Like in my head, the best thing that anybody can do is just experiment with themselves, right? Like experiment with their recovery times, and, you know, because everybody's different to some extent. Everybody's different in all extents, I guess, in genetic codes and life experiences. So like it's very hard to pigeonhole. I mean, obviously there's similarities, and there'll always be in a range in responses. Some people might respond to this stuff, some people might not, you know, and it's, you know, just because it works for one person doesn't mean it's going to work for you. Just like, you know, in the sports gene, people can train the same way. Somebody gets massive gains, somebody gets no gains, but over the long run, the person who gets massive gains tapers off, and the person who does slow but steady ends up, you know, making massive gains over the course of, you know, a year. So that's very hard to say. So the last note we got on this chapter was how to facilitate blood flow. So many athletes believe that they require special tools to improve their blood flow. However, as athletes are already active, their blood flow is typically very good. In fact, exercise is one of the easiest and most effective methods of enhancing your blood flow. So to promote blood flow and help tired muscles recover, it is recommended that athletes engage in gentle exercise, such as the easy spinning on trainers that the Tour de France riders do after races. This technique is known as active recovery or a warm down, and it aids in clearing out byproducts of intense exercise, such as lactate. I love it. Once again, it's just like, if you want to increase your blood flow, just, you know, warm down, do active recovery, go for a walk, do something which increases your blood flow, but like not on a massive extent.
No, exactly.
So let's just finish this last chapter, and then we'll be halfway through. So we got chapter 6, calming the senses.
Beautiful.
So optimal recovery requires a certain state of mind, one that doesn't always come naturally to highly driven athletes. I once had a coach tell me, any fool can go train more, it takes courage to rest. Common problems among athletes who tend to be a self-motivated bunch is they get angsty and anxious when they aren't doing their sports. So it feels good to push ourselves, and we've been taught that hard work translates into success. It's tempting to conflate resting with quitting or going soft, but as Neistat, the coach, explained to Christie, sometimes the path to performance requires doing less and not more. And then we've got psychological stress, which is, I thought this is quite an interesting chapter because, you know, not a lot of thought is put into the psychological stress and sport. So yes, initially, scientific models of training, recovery, and adaptation did not consider the role of psychological stress. According to Jonathan Peake, a sports scientist at Queensland University of Technology in Brisbane, Australia, the psychological aspects of recovery have been overlooked, while the focus has been mainly on the physical aspects. Peake believes that general feelings of health and wellness play an essential role in how individuals recover and adapt to training. This could be the exciting frontier of recovery research. Psychological stress not only impairs recovery, but also blunts the body's ability to adapt to training. Athletes tend to think of recovery only in terms of planned physical exercise and ignore the emotional strains on their bodies. It is not only about running and performing exercise, but what is done after the workout is also critical. The emotional content of a potential stressor and how stressful it feels are what matters when it comes to stress. How stressful it feels depends mainly on the expectations, personal circumstances, genetics, and upbringing, and these inclinations are not fixed. Achieving real recovery necessitates nurturing a recovery mindset, one that fully acknowledges the body's need to recuperate and knows when to relax. This attitude can be challenging to cultivate in a culture that constantly bombards us with messages to go hard or go home. We are conditioned to push through the pain and do one more mile or one more set. Streakers who will run every day for years are celebrated, but if the body's not recovering and adapting to those runs, And the athlete is only logging junk miles that wear them down instead of building them up. And yeah, I mean, we're all guilty to that to some extent, especially when you get yourself into a training mindset. It feels bad to have a day off, right? It feels bad to
yeah.
You feel like you're skimping. You feel like you're or like there's that self-doubt, which is like, am I actually not able to go, or am I just being a pussy, essentially?
Yeah. And I think it's quite hard to actually identify. Like, I've thought about it recently where, like, the last week I felt a bit drained.
Yeah.
And I've been going to the gym quite a lot. And so I'm thinking, like, well, am I tired? Do I need a break? Or am I just being a pussy and don't want to go to the gym?
Yeah.
I think sometimes it can be quite difficult.
And then you've got people like David Goggins who makes it super toxic when he's like, destroying his kneecaps or whatever and continuing running. Like, it's just, and obviously Ross Edgley just equally as bad, where they just swim around the whole of the United Kingdom through blisters and all sorts. And then you just think, what's my excuse? But
no, exactly. And I think, it's almost like you're training a different thing. It's not so much that you're overcoming a boundary. Well, you might be overcoming a boundary physically, but also mentally, like, it doesn't matter. And I think that's what she was kind of tapping into here, where, like, the expectation of stress is something really important. If you reduce your baseline, right? So, like, I think she was talking about when she would go traveling for the ski team that she was part of, and there'd be issues with hotels now and then, or this or whatever, and she would get really flustered and really stressed about it, and her coach was like, look, this is literally part of the job, right? You can't do anything. It's kind of stoic, like, it's out of your control. So change your expectation. Expect that this is going to happen now and then you don't get as stressed. And I think that's something that's really kind of important, because, we get stressed about so many things because we just, our baseline is so low. And so we're sensitive, and then that causes stress. And I think we kind of just need to be realistic and once get kind of stoic about it sometimes. And it allows us to handle it much better.
Yeah, and if I remember correctly, in this chapter, she did the floating chambers, and she was kind of saying that actually it was one of the few things she actually kind of walks away recommending. She was like,
fucking loved it.
She absolutely loved it. It was interesting. Is because she almost even admitted, to be honest, at this point, because obviously when it's psychological, it's a bit more airy-fairy, right?
Yeah.
With the other stuff, it was more like, numbers-based or science-based or whatever. Whereas this is more obviously like, kind of when you're stressed and when you're not, so it's more subjective. So her point was, when she did the floating chambers, so when you float on the salt water, and I think you've done it, haven't you? She basically said she felt incredibly calm, and that there was definitely an effect from doing it that she would recommend people do for stress specifically.
It was quite funny because I was reading yesterday, and then I was like, so my sister got me like a free voucher at one of them that I haven't used yet, because I was like waiting for a right time, and now I'm not really even thinking about it like for physiological wise, but more psychological wise. So I booked it in for the day that I like handed my dissertation. So I'm just going to head
lovely. That's lovely. Yeah. It's funny, isn't it? Actually, this psychological stress element to stuff, because I've come to realize recently that back in the day I would hate the thought. I think I've spoken to you about this before, but like walks used to be so boring. Like the thought of walking in nature when I was a kid, I was like, what the hell would I want to do that? I could play video games or whatever. Whereas now I like the thought of like just booking, like, I don't know, like a holiday, like in a mountain range where there's no phone signal, or just hiking and stuff. I think you were saying about the pilgrimage or whatever. So like that to me now is actually super interesting. Like just like peace, if that makes sense. Like just away from the world, just no distractions, just peace. And I feel like that's probably like the takeaway from this chapter. Like we do need a level of psychological release, or whatever you want to call it, where you just you chill and you don't think about anything. A bit like, I mean, obviously she didn't really go into it, but meditation would have been a prime example of something here that would have fit in, but I didn't remember her talking about it very much.
I think she talked a bit about it in terms of Headspace.
Yes, the app,
yeah, but didn't like go into that much detail, but did talk about it as like a means of kind of dealing with psychological, like emotional stress, because essentially it's the physical aspect of performance is not the only component. It's psychosomatic. It's psychology is entangled in it, and you can't get rid of it, and so you have to account for it as well as part of your recovery.
So that's the first part of Good to Go then. We've got lots more. Well, I think we're roughly about halfway there or slightly over it.
I think
We've got
so.
some chapters on sleep, some supplements. What else do we have chapters on here? Let me just have a little look. So supplements, overtraining. Chapter on overtraining, then a chapter on placebo, and then that's the end. So there's not too long left. Thanks for bearing with us. It was quite a short book, I think. I don't remember it being specifically long, but there's just a lot to talk about because, it's just a lot of different ideas. Well, one main idea, which I guess is just trusting your body more over some of the scientific methods that we come about, but a lot of different areas to explore, and there's still much more to come.
Exactly. So, I'm looking forward to it. Cool.
Me too. That's a wrap.
That's a wrap. Hey guys, well there you have it. We hope you enjoyed that book summary. Now we know it can be a lot to take in all at once, so if you want to be able to read this in a more palatable size, or you want to be able to implement any of those key actionable ideas that we were talking about in this episode, head on over to our website at wisewords.blog, where the book summary will be waiting for you. Also, don't forget to check out our socials as we consistently upload the key ideas, benefits, and actionable ideas from all the books that we read. The links to those will be in the description below. Now, we want to be able to get you the best content in a way that's really easy to understand, but we need your help. Your opinion matters. So you are our feedback mechanism. And with those quick actions, whether that's leaving us a like or a dislike, commenting in the comment section below, or subscribing to our channel, all of those help us gauge what we're doing well and how to improve on our method of delivery. So if you have any thoughts on the matter, don't hesitate to act. It takes less than 10 seconds and it really helps us out. But with all that being said, until next time, stay wise.